The story that we are going to tell today is about a Hollywood actor whose life took a dark and violent turn, and it ended in a way that practically no one could have expected. A great number of individuals have not been exposed to this tale, but once it has been told to you, it is one that you will never be able to forget. Beginning with a young boy who had a dream of being on TV, everything begins with him. Johnny Lewis was only 7 years old when he was cast in his very first acting role throughout his childhood. In all honesty, it wasn't a major motion picture or a well-known television show. Rather, it was a little part in a video about escalator safety. To a child, however, it was a beginning, and it was the beginning of a career that would last a lifetime. Johnny began his career making appearances in dozens of commercials for major businesses, such as Pizza Hut, after he was cast in that little role. In a short amount of time, many working in the sector were able to recognize that this young man possessed actual talent. He was not merely another attractive face, he had the ability to seriously act. Soon after, he began making guest appearances on some of the most popular television shows running during the latter part of the 1990s and the early 2000s. These shows included Seventh Heaven, Malcolm in the Middle, and Drake and Josh. Johnny had reached the age of 18 by the year 2001. Having been employed in a consistent manner for a number of years, he had finally amassed sufficient funds to leave his parents' residence in the North Los Angeles neighborhood. When he moved in with a number of other young actors and actresses who were all striving to make their mark in the entertainment industry, he discovered a place that was located right in the middle of Hollywood. It was a thrilling period that was brimming with opportunities. The trajectory of Johnny's career continued to advance. Fast forward to the year 2006. Now that he is 23 years old, Johnny is simply soaring to new heights. He had secured more big jobs on television, including a recurring role on the immensely popular show The O.C. His face was becoming more and more known to millions of people. His personal life was also making headlines, in addition to the success he had achieved in his professional life. The megapop singer Katy Perry was his girlfriend at the time. The intensity of their relationship was stated to be extremely high, despite the fact that it did not persist for a very long time. It was so intense, in fact, that Katy would go on to write 2 songs that were inspired by their time together, according to reports. However, Johnny's true breakthrough into the public eye, the role that would come to define his career, did not come until 2008, 2 years later. Sons of Anarchy is a brand new biker drama, and he was chosen to play the role of Kip Halfsack Epps in the show. Both in terms of critical acclaim and financial success, the show was a giant. Not only did it make Johnny famous, but it also made him extraordinarily wealthy. He was a darling among the audience, and it appeared as though his future was sealed. And he had succeeded. However, there could be an issue. Johnny was finding himself increasingly anxious about the path that the show was headed, despite the fact that the entire globe adored the show. He had the impression that it was growing unusually violent. Let's face it, Johnny was not the fierce biker character that he portrayed on television. When he was in his real life, he was a quiet and thoughtful individual. When he was not studying philosophy, he enjoyed reading poetry. He did not appreciate going out to parties, but rather drank tea and played chess. He preferred staying up late. In his opinion, the concept of acting out scenes of violence that he considered to be unnecessary was not something that he felt comfortable with. He was not the same person as a result of that. Therefore, after 2 really successful seasons on the show, during which his character had become one of the most popular, he did something that was almost unheard of in the entertainment industry during that time. The writers of the show were informed by him that they needed to remove me from the screenplay. He went to them and told them, "This is something that I am no longer able to perform." The authors were utterly taken aback by the news. They pleaded with him to remain, telling him how well-liked he was and what the potential implications of this post could be for his future. However, Johnny had already made up his mind. As a result, his character, Halfsack, was sadly killed off on the show in 2009, bringing an end to his stint on production. Johnny came to the conclusion that he required a break from acting on a serious level when he left Sons of Anarchy. He desired to direct his efforts towards something that was more intimate, something creative, that was wholly and fully his own unique creation. He had the desire to compose a novel. It was originally planned that the novel would be about a young musical prodigy who was attempting to find his place in the world. In order to accomplish this, he was aware that he required a serene and calm location where he could concentrate without being distracted by the activities that were taking place in Hollywood. In order to find out if anyone knew of a location similar to that, he began doing some asking around and chatting to his pals. The writer's villa was a location that was mentioned at the time by his photographer. This stunning, expansive home with 6 bedrooms was available for rent and was situated just outside of Hollywood. It was known as the writer's villa. It had developed a reputation over the years as a type of haven for aspiring artists, performers, and authors who were still attempting to find their big break. This reputation had been earned over the course of many years. Kathy Davis, who was 81 years old at the time, was the proprietor, and she was the primary reason for this reputation. Kathy was a very nice and kind-hearted woman who had a deep understanding of how challenging and isolating it could be to pursue one's dreams in the Hollywood industry. She was responsible for the well-being of those who remained in her home. She would prepare meals for them, provide transportation for them if they required it, and she would frequently stay up late, simply listening to their expressions of anger and providing a shoulder to weep on when they were not given a part that they desired. A significant number of her previous tenants, who went on to achieve enormous success in the entertainment industry, would later claim that the time they spent with Kathy at the villa was, at the very least, partially responsible for their achievement. When they thought back on it, they recalled it as a moment that was therapeutic and relaxing, a quiet in the storm that was the industry. In spite of the fact that Johnny had already achieved his major success, he was enamored with the concept of residing in such a tranquil location, a location that appeared to be geared toward eccentric and artistic individuals just like him. As a result, Johnny called Kathy in April of 2009 and inquired as to whether or not she had a room available. Obviously, she stated that it was a given. There is a crimson suite on the 2nd floor that you are welcome to stay in. Following his move into the writer's villa, Johnny shared with his pals that it exceeded his expectations in terms of its level of awe and wonder. Furthermore, Kathy, in particular, lived up to the expectations that had been set by everyone. The elderly landlady and he became fast friends almost immediately after meeting each other. For a period of time, it appeared that everything was going according to Johnny's plan. His life was heading in the direction that he truly desired it to go. His life then took an unexpected turn just a few months later, but that was not the case. The news that his girlfriend, Diane, was expecting a child came to him. Johnny was truly pleased at the prospect of being a father, despite the fact that this entirely altered his intentions for finishing his work. In a responsible manner, he made the decision to act. He left the tranquil villa and moved in with Diane, who lived in the neighborhood, so that he could be present to assist with the care of their child. In the year 2010, on April 6th, Diane gave birth to a healthy baby girl whom they called Culame. This occurred 9 months subsequently. Upon the birth of their daughter, Johnny and Diane fell head over heels in love with her. Unfortuitously, the pressures of fatherhood caused their love for each other to diminish rapidly, which negatively impacted their relationship. Within a short period of time, their relationship had deteriorated to the point where Johnny decided to leave, and this time he went back to live with his parents. Johnny and Diane were involved in a custody battle over their daughter, Culame, that was extremely violent, drawn out, and excruciating. This conflict began not long after the collapse of their relationship. Johnny was ultimately unsuccessful in the fight, which lasted for several months. He was completely and utterly devastated by the verdict that the court made. Around a few months later, in October of 2011, Johnny was still residing at his parents' home, and he was experiencing feelings of disorientation and depression. For the sole purpose of going for a ride and attempting to get his thoughts organized, he made the decision to ride his motorcycle one day. To the west of Los Angeles, he traveled for around 2 hours, and then he continued on into the desert. It was at that moment that he lost control of his motorcycle and came to a crash. He was transported to the hospital, where it was initially discovered that his injuries were not quite as severe as one might expect. The medical professionals were a little worried that he might have suffered a brain injury, but after conducting a series of tests, they found that he did not have a concussion. He was released home after they assured him that he was fine. Nevertheless, he was not in good health when he returned home from the hospital. As a matter of fact, he was an entirely different individual. Michael, Johnny's father, was the first person to pick up on the significant behavioral shift that his son had undergone. Johnny has recently appeared to be behaving in a really strange and irregular manner. In addition to being agitated and irritable all the time, his thoughts were not always cohesive, he would ramble, and he couldn't stop talking. The fact that something was gravely wrong was so clear to his family that they couldn't ignore it. Michael, his father, was perplexed by this information. It is possible that his son sustained a head injury as a result of the motorcycle accident. Maybe the medical staff at the hospital simply failed to notice it. After that, Michael made arrangements for Johnny to have 2 independent MRIs so that he could get a better look at his brain. But Johnny did not show up for either of his appointments, and he never provided an explanation for his decision. Approximately at the same time, Johnny's pals started to take notice of his peculiar behavior themselves. In December of that year, he was attending an acting class, and throughout the entirety of the session, he began speaking with an accent that was reminiscent of British. Every single person in the classroom appeared to be staring at each other as if they were perplexed by the situation. In the end, someone finally confronted him with the question, "Hey, why are you talking like that? In a state of bewilderment, Johnny simply stared at them and asked, "Like what?" In response, he simply shrugged his shoulders and pretended as if he had no idea what they were talking about. The situation became far more dire a few weeks later, on the morning of the 3rd of January 2012, when it was at its peak. Johnny was at his parents' house, where he was observing his mother as she prepared omelets. He was seated in the kitchen. The sudden appearance of Johnny, who suddenly rose up and announced, "I'm going to go out for a walk," came out of nowhere. He stands up, and the only thing he is wearing is his pajamas. He is not even wearing shoes at this point. He exits the house by the front door, and as he is heading down the road, he is approximately 10 to 15 feet away from his parents' residence. At that point, he claims to have heard someone yelling something that sounded like they were in a great deal of anguish. It occurred to him that the screams were emanating from an apartment that was situated just adjacent to the residence of his parents. In light of this, he did not hesitate before breaking into the apartment. Upon entering, however, he saw that there was no one present. Not a single person was present in the residence. At the very moment when he was standing in this vacant flat, completely bewildered, the 2 guys who owned the unit returned home. When they entered, they saw Johnny standing in the living room, and he was there alone. They informed him that he was required to leave without delay. However, rather than making his departure, Johnny did something that was entirely unexpected. He then charged at them, bashing both of them over the head with the bottle. However, they were able to tackle him, detain him, and hold him down until the police arrived. He then grabbed a glass bottle that was nearby and charged at them. Johnny claimed that he was acting in self-defense when he was questioned by the police, but the police did not believe his account for a single second. Trespassing, burglary, and assault with a deadly weapon were the charges that were brought against him, and he was taken custody of and placed in jail. A total of 8 exhausting days had passed by the time Johnny's father was eventually able to post bail and release his son from jail. The condition of Johnny had deteriorated during the course of those 8 days. The general population portion of the jail had been moved to the psychiatric unit, and he had been transferred there. The security personnel reported that he was beating his head against the concrete walls of his cell on a regular basis. He had attempted to leap off a balcony that was located on the second floor at one time. He was simply behaving in a manner that was utterly out of control. As a result, a physician working at the correctional facility had left a statement on his paperwork when he was ultimately released from jail. Based on his observations, the physician stated that he was of the opinion that Johnny must have sustained some kind of head injury at some point in time, which was the reason for his behavior. The physician also made the observation that Johnny was unquestionably suicidal. Johnny was a complete and utter mess when he arrived at his parents' place after it had been a long time. The battle that he had with the two men in the flat had left him with two black eyes, and his face was swollen and bruised as a result of the altercation that he had with them. The emotional turmoil he was experiencing was so severe that he would not allow any member of his family to even come close to him. The only thing he did was lock himself in his room and tell everyone to not come near him. A heightened sensitivity to light was another symptom that he had. The situation became so dire that he began walking around his parents' house and shutting out each and every light individually. As soon as his parents eventually turned them back on, he would become upset and angry, and then he would go and turn them all off completely again. At long last, in a moment of exasperation, he walked to the fuse box that belonged to his parents and just turned off the power completely, therefore putting the entire house into full darkness. Nevertheless, in spite of the fact that Johnny had very visible problems after returning home from jail, it appeared that he was making some progress over the course of the subsequent few weeks. Despite the fact that it was a gradual process, there were times when he appeared to be more like his previous self. His parents believed that he had made sufficient progress by the time the month of January came to a close, over a month after he had returned home, and they gave him permission to move out and live on his own once more. It took him around 30 minutes to travel to Santa Monica, California, where he discovered a place to stay. However, as soon as he moved out on his own, he began to experience difficulties once more to a greater extent. On the 10th of February, he was arrested for striking a random stranger in the head outside of a yogurt shop. This occurred only about a week after he had moved into his new house in Santa Monica. Under the terms of a bail of $20,000, he was released. After a number of days had passed, Johnny simply walked into the ocean while wearing all of his clothes. It was necessary for strangers to rescue him from the icy water, and he was then transported to the hospital to receive treatment for hypothermia upon his arrival. The second time he was taken into custody came just a few days after he had been released from the hospital. For the second time, he was apprehended while attempting to break into the apartment of a woman in Santa Monica. When he was apprehended by the authorities, he stated that he had considered the apartment to be that of his friend. However, once again, nobody believed him. Again, he was taken back to jail, and then he was released on bond before being released. Johnny's parents were finally successful in persuading him to schedule an appointment with a medical professional regarding the possible head injury they believed he had sustained as a result of the motorbike accident that occurred in 2011. This second arrest took place in Santa Monica. However, despite the fact that the doctor at the jailhouse had speculated that Johnny had sustained a head injury, he had not officially diagnosed him. Johnny needed the assistance of a second physician in order to receive a definitive diagnosis, which would allow them to finally start treating whatever ailment he was experiencing. However, the physician that Johnny ultimately went to see had a different point of view. A brain injury was not anything he suspected. As an alternative, he had a strong suspicion that Johnny was suffering from either schizophrenia or bipolar illness, both of which are quite severe mental conditions. The result was that he gave Johnny a prescription for a potent drug that would treat both of those illnesses, and then he sent Johnny on his way. Still, Johnny was adamant about not taking the prescription. His rejection was complete. In addition to this, he declined to get a second opinion from a different physician. Due to the fact that he was not receiving any therapy, his condition continued to deteriorate. There was still a significant possibility that Johnny would be sentenced to jail for the break-in and the assault that he committed against those two men in the flat that was adjacent to his parents' house. His attorney was exerting a great deal of effort in an effort to negotiate a plea bargain for Johnny in which he would be sentenced to a year of therapy at a mental health hospital rather than being sent to jail. Johnny, however, was so naive in his belief that all of the accusations would simply be dropped and that he would be let to return to his life and live the way he desired, that he decided to terminate his attorney. It was his decision to act as his own attorney in court. It turned out to be a really bad choice. His sentence of 1 year in prison was handed down by the judge, and the charges against him were not withdrawn. However, because the facility to which he was sent was so badly overcrowded, they ultimately decided to reduce his sentence to merely 6 weeks for the whole duration of his sentence. Johnny was at an all-time low when his father finally came to pick him up from prison on Friday, the 21st of September 2012. Johnny's father had been incarcerated for years. Despite the fact that he had only been incarcerated for a period of 6 weeks, rather than the entire year that he had been sentenced to, it was evident that the small amount of time that he had spent in jail had caused him a great deal of personal harm. He was emaciated, reserved, and appeared to be in rudimentary condition. Johnny turned to his father in a kind of bashful manner as they were driving back from the prison. He asked his father, "You know, Dad, would it be possible if you called Kathy Davis at the writer's villa?" Johnny's father nodded his head in agreement. "I just wanted to check and see if there was any possibility that I could move back in." It was Michael, his father, who gave it some thought for a brief while. It was something he hadn't thought about before, yet it made complete sense. The writer's villa was the final residence that Johnny had occupied during the time that his life was still in order. Most likely, that was the very last place in which he felt genuine happiness. He must have associated that location with a great deal of pleasant and tranquil recollection. It was a wonderful concept, Michael thought, and it was the ideal location for him to go to in order to make an effort to put his life back together. Michael immediately placed a phone call to Kathy Davis as soon as they returned to the house. After describing the entire scenario and everything that Johnny had been through, he inquired as to whether or not there was any possibility that he could remain there. And without a single second of doubt, Kathy responded with an unequivocal yes. "It is still possible to purchase the red suite. Immediately, I will walk up to the bedroom and make the bed for him. I can't wait to meet him in person." Johnny spent the weekend with his parents, and then on Monday, September 24th, he moved back into the villa after packing up his belongings and moving back in with them. 2 days later, on the morning of September 26th, a man named Dan Blackburn, who was the next-door neighbor to the writer's villa property, was looking out his front window. Blackburn was 70 years old at the time. Along the route, he noticed a man who was standing out. The only thing the man was wearing was a pair of red sneakers and a pair of trousers. He was furiously pacing back and forth in the center of the street, he was completely drenched in sweat, and he was not wearing a shirt by any stretch of the imagination. Dan had never encountered this individual before, and his conduct was peculiar. So he just kind of watched him from behind his curtain, attempting to figure out what he was going to do next. Following around 15 minutes of this peculiar and anxious pacing in the road, the man abruptly turned and walked directly towards Dan's property where he had been standing. After walking straight up to the front steps, he began to knock on the door while he was there. In spite of the fact that Dan was feeling a little anxious, he went ahead and closed the curtain, then went to his front door and peered through the peephole into his home. The man was standing there when he noticed him. He had these brilliant blue eyes that were wide open, and he was staring at the peephole as if he could see Dan standing on the other side of it. He appeared to be able to see through it. After taking a deep breath, Dan unlocked the door and opened it slightly. He then opened it a little bit more. When he looked out, the person who was standing outside greeted him and introduced himself as John. Hello, I am your new neighbor. It was inevitable that John would be revealed to be Johnny Lewis on the subject. The door was opened a little bit farther by Dan, who was attempting to be sociable. He then added, "Hello, John, it's nice to meet you." However, before the two men could engage in any type of genuine discourse, Johnny quickly turned around and walked away without saying a single word. At this point, Dan is left standing there, very perplexed by the peculiar interaction that he has just experienced. He observes Johnny as he simply walks back to the road, then walks back over to the writer's villa, enters the building, and then vanishes from view. In a manner that could be described as a shrug, Dan decided to close and lock his door before returning to his morning routine. Dan is in another area of his house, simply doing his own thing, when he hears his wife outside, yelling his name and urging him to come outside immediately. This happens around 30 minutes later. As soon as Dan exits the main door, he dashes into his driveway, which is the area that separates his property from the writer's villa. He notices his wife standing on the driveway, and she appears to be in complete and utter disbelief. In the direction of the back of their house, she is pointing upward. While Dan is looking in the direction that she is pointing, he notices Johnny Lewis standing close to their deck. A second man, the worker that Dan and his wife had hired that day to paint their back deck, is standing on top of Johnny. Johnny is standing on their back. This guy is getting a never-ending stream of blows from Johnny. He also has a piece of wood in his possession, which he is using to strike him. The unfortunate worker is currently lying on the ground, attempting to protect himself from the blood that is running down his body. It was just that Dan's instincts took control. He makes his way over to them. Due to the fact that Johnny is so intent on the assault, he has failed to notice Dan coming closer. Dan immediately approaches him, grabs him by the shoulder, and makes an attempt to remove Johnny from the painter's grasp all at once. Johnny is being yelled at by him to stop himself and to get off of him. On the other hand, Johnny appears to be completely unmoved. Just like a machine, he is destroying this worker from the inside out. When Dan finally pulls as hard as he can on Johnny's shoulder, Johnny finally jumps up and stands up right away. After turning around, he delivers a single punch to Dan's face, bringing him to the same level as before. Dan suffers a severe fall to the ground. Johnny is simply standing over him and looking down at him with no expression on his face. When he glances up, he sees Johnny standing over him. It appeared as though he had no idea what he was going to do with Dan in the next instance. He did nothing but stand there and stare with those eyes that were so big and vacant. On the other hand, Dan was not going to squander any time in his attempt to figure it out. Immediately after jumping back up to his feet, he struck Johnny with as much force as he could muster, delivering a blow to the side of his skull. On the other hand, Johnny was completely unaffected by the punch. At no point did he even flinch. Simply staring at Dan without making any facial expressions, he continued to look. Therefore, Dan, in a state of panic, grabbed a metal lawn chair that was nearby, and he nearly shattered it over Johnny's head to get him to sit down. Once again, however, it had little impact. Johnny did nothing but stand there, staring at Dan without forming any expression on his face. At this time, Dan was aware that he was doing nothing to win this fight. Therefore, he simply grabbed the painter, who was so weak that he could not stand up, and he assisted him in running back down the driveway. He grabbed his wife, and the three of them rushed in the direction of their home in order to go inside and be safe. The three of them were able to make their way into the house, and just as they were attempting to close the large and massive front door, Johnny came running up the stairs. At precisely the moment that they were closing the door, he arrived at the door and pushed his arm into the gap that existed between the door and the doorframe. For some reason, they were unable to shut the door because it was getting caught on his arm. So at this point, all three of the adults inside, Dan, his wife, and the injured painter, are exerting all of their combined weight on this enormous wooden door in an attempt to crush Johnny's arm. However, Johnny is only attempting to grab at them through the opening. Finally, the three of them begin to heave the door back and slam it onto Johnny's arm as forcefully as they possibly can, repeatedly. They do this over and over again. Johnny was finally able to retract his arm after being subjected to a series of powerful strikes that were crushing, and they were able to slam the door shut and lock it. It was at this time that Dan's wife and the painter went throughout the remainder of the house, making sure that every window was shut and every door was locked. They wanted to ensure that there was no other way for him to enter the house. While this was going on, Dan moved to a side window that had a view of the writer's villa property. While his eyes searched the yard for Johnny, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. He was currently hunting for Johnny. The moment he finishes explaining what is going on to the 911 operator and hangs up, Johnny suddenly materializes out of nowhere. The way he is rushing down Dan's driveway gives the impression that he is heading back towards the back deck. At that moment, however, he comes to a stop practically just in front of the window that Dan is seeing out of. He makes a turn and immediately begins to run at full speed in the direction of the villa property. When he reaches a barrier that is at least waist high, he simply leaps over it without pausing his stride in any way. After that, he arrives to this enormous wooden fence that encircled the entire area owned by the villa. This fence stood at a height of at least 8, 9, and possibly 10 feet. In a very simple and straightforward manner, he simply leaps, grabs the top, and launches himself directly over the top, vanishing within the confines of the villa's grounds. The police arrived within a few minutes of the call. In an effort to locate Johnny, they proceeded inside the villa, and the things that they discovered there were beyond their comprehension. These are the events that the investigators believe took place that morning based on the evidence that was found at the scene. Johnny had turned around after he had initially approached Dan's property and awkwardly knocked on the door, introducing himself as the new neighbor. He had then introduced himself to Dan. Dan watched him as he walked away from the grounds and made his way back inside the writer's villa while he was there. The moment Johnny entered the villa, he made his way to the second story where he entered Kathy Davis's room where she was at the time. Johnny then proceeded to the second floor. The compassionate woman, Kathy, who was 81 years old, most likely turned around and spotted Johnny standing in the doorway of her home. It appeared as though he was completely insane since he was drenched in sweat and he was not wearing a shirt. On the other hand, she most likely did not feel terrified at first. It is likely that her maternal instincts came into play. She most likely asked Johnny, "Are you okay?" or anything along those lines. "Is it possible for me to assist you? How are things going?" And while she was probably standing up and making her way over to him to make sure he was okay, Johnny proceeded to beat her, kick her, and strangle her for reasons that no one will ever understand. He did this for reasons that no one will ever understand. And then, once she had fallen to the ground and was completely defenseless, Johnny proceeded to either continuously stamp on her skull or hit her over the head with a rusty hammer that was subsequently discovered in his bedroom. Both of these actions were carried out in a manner that was quite violent. But regardless of the specific manner in which Johnny carried out his actions, he was able to cause a major fracture to her skull, which was eventually the cause of her death. Following his murder of Kathy, Johnny immediately went in search of her cherished cat and proceeded to kill the cat in the same heinous manner. After that, Johnny raced out of the villa, and it was at that moment that he must have seen Dan's house painter sitting outside, doing nothing but minding his own business. While Johnny was walking over to him, he immediately started pounding him. In the same way that the awful attack on Kathy and her cat appeared to have no reason whatsoever, this attack on the house painter appeared to have no reason at all. It was utterly arbitrary and made no sense at all. Johnny waited outside for a few minutes before running down Dan's driveway after Dan came outside and was able to fight off Johnny. After Dan went back inside the home with his wife and the painter, Johnny then ran down Dan's driveway. Following that, he jumped over those two fences just in front of Dan, and then Johnny vanished back inside the villa. It is believed that once Johnny was back inside the villa property, he climbed up to an upper patio or possibly onto the roof of the villa where he was staying. From that vantage point, he proceeded to either jump or fall to his death on the concrete driveway that was located below. It has been determined that his death was not a suicide, but rather an accident. Everyone who heard the story concluded that Johnny must have been under the influence of some extremely potent narcotics after the word broke about what had occurred at the writer's villa. When it came to explaining why someone would behave in such a manner with such excessive, unjustified aggression and what appeared to be superhuman strength, that seemed to be the only plausible answer. However, the toxicology result provided by the coroner's office revealed that he did not possess any drugs, whether they were legal or illicit, in his system. This was the case regardless of the type of substance. At the time that he did this heinous murder, he was absolutely free of any alcohol or drugs. Because of the motorbike accident, there are some individuals, including his family, who are of the opinion that Johnny actually did suffer from a significant head injury that was not properly diagnosed. They are of the opinion that this brain injury is the cause of his violent outbursts, as well as the entire transformation of his personality. There are those that disagree. People believe that the head damage explanation does not adequately explain everything. They are of the opinion that Johnny had a mental condition that was not properly diagnosed. It's possible that it was schizophrenia, or it could have been bipolar disorder, or it could have been something else different. However, this mental condition was the root cause of the psychosis that resulted in these violent outbursts among the individuals. No one, however, is able to definitively explain why Johnny Lewis acted in the manner that he did. The only thing that we know for certain is that a woman who was nice and innocent, as well as her beloved pet, has been cruelly and needlessly murdered, and that a story that started out with Hollywood hopes has ended up being a nightmare that cannot be explained. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up?
One night in December of 2009, a man was digging through a pile of papers and photo albums inside of an RV that was parked in Texas. The man had recently bought this trailer after its previous owner had died. And so now he was finding it was full of junk that he was trying to sort through. And as he rifled through the documents, he stumbled on a stack of old notebooks. He opened one up, and he began to read it. And as he did, he felt his heartbeat pick up because the notebooks were actually diaries. They were full of handwritten rantings about demons and monsters and a deal with the devil. But that wasn't what scared him. What really scared the guy was this writer's horrifying confession. On the night of the 24th of July, 1987, a 30-year-old woman named Susan Woods stood at the entrance to a local fair in a little city called Hyco, located in central Texas. She was there with her best friend and her best friend's boyfriend. The three of them were just standing there trying to decide if they wanted to continue to stay or if they should just leave. As they stood there, they could hear people having fun on all the rides. There were kids laughing and screaming. It was a Friday night, and they had chosen to come here. This was supposed to be their fun activity for the evening. But so far, the night really had not been that great. Susan's best friend, a woman named Cindy Hallmark, and her boyfriend, a man named Roy Hayes, had convinced Susan to come out with them to this fair because Susan's life, of late, had been really quite bad. She was in the middle of a very ugly divorce, and the new guy that she had been dating had wound up being very pushy when it came to physical intimacy, and so she had recently dumped him too. And so Susan's life, certainly her relationships anyway, were in pretty rough shape. Cindy and Roy had convinced Susan to come out with them and, for at least one night, just come enjoy this fair. Forget about everything else and just have some fun. And so Susan had agreed to go. However, once they actually got to the fair and the three of them were walking around, playing games and going into the haunted house and doing all the things you do at a fair, it had been Cindy, not Susan, who had ultimately said that she wasn't really having a good time. She said that she just had this really intense feeling that something bad was about to happen. It was like this constant anxiety, and she just couldn't shake it, and it was making it really hard to enjoy the night. And so that was why the trio was standing at the gate, wondering if it was even worth staying any longer. Ultimately, Roy finally just said, "You know what? Why don't we just leave and head back to Stephenville? That's where they all lived. It's where they grew up, too." He suggested they could go back to Stephenville and just drive around for a bit, and eventually they could go to the Dairy Queen restaurant and get some ice cream. When Roy suggested this, both Susan and Cindy thought it was a great idea. And so they left. They hopped in Roy's truck and began the drive back to Stephenville. About an hour and a half later, Susan, Cindy, and Roy walked into the Stephenville Dairy Queen. They ordered ice cream sundaes and then sat down at a booth. By this point, Cindy's feeling of dread, that feeling that something bad was going to happen, had mostly gone away. And so the mood was much lighter. And Susan especially was actually having a great night, the first one in a long time. It felt like the last 6 months or so had been some of the worst in Susan's entire life. Her ex-husband, Michael Woods, who she had been with since she was in her early 20s, had effectively abandoned her back in February. He had taken her car and also some expensive crystals that she had collected. And he had left behind a viciously mean tape recording of all the things he hated about her, along with dozens of cruel notes with insults on them hidden all over the place. And so Susan had filed for divorce. And then, instead of trying to get her car back from her husband, who was long gone, she just began doing a ton of overtime at the sandpaper factory where she worked in order to afford another car. And so in these few months immediately following the breakup with her ex, and with all this extra work she was doing, Susan had really fallen into a deep depression. But it had been Cindy and Roy who had helped her pull herself back together. Susan was naturally very shy, and she did not have a big social circle. But Cindy, on the other hand, was very extroverted, had a ton of friends, and a lot of close cousins. She had persuaded Susan to begin coming to their regular meetups with all her friends and cousins. The core group that typically attended these meetups was Cindy, Roy, Cindy's cousins, Regina and Scott Hatley, and then maybe one or two others. And collectively, they referred to themselves as the members of the round table, because often these meetups consisted of just spending the whole night sitting around Cindy's round kitchen table, talking and drinking. The first time Susan had gone, it had seemed like such a tight-knit group that she really just kind of felt like a third wheel and did not belong. But everyone had really treated her like she did belong. And these days, she did not miss a meetup because this was like her new community. It really made her happy. And so, slowly but surely, Susan had begun to feel better, largely because of these meetups. And so now, as she looked across the table at Cindy, jokingly trying to force-feed Roy all this ice cream, Susan just smiled. Roy was this big guy, but he was losing the fight, and he had chocolate sauce all over his chin. They were just kind of goofing around. And she just thought to herself, you know what? Tonight was a great night. My life is turning around. And suddenly, she had an idea. Susan stood up from the table and, without saying anything, she walked up to the counter and she promptly ordered a second hot fudge sundae. When she carried it back over to the table with a big grin on her face, Cindy and Roy kind of looked at her surprised and were kind of impressed even, which was exactly the reaction that Susan was hoping for. Normally, Susan was very conscious of her weight and wouldn't even finish one sundae. But tonight, she just felt like she had been set free. She was just going to have fun. But unfortunately for Susan, the ice cream sundaes were really the last fun thing she got to enjoy that entire weekend because she spent all day Saturday on the line at the sandpaper factory where she worked. And then all day Sunday, she was grocery shopping, doing laundry, and straightening up the house. By about 8 p.m. Sunday night, she had put away all of her laundry. She had made the bed and picked up the last few items off the bedroom floor. Her house was small, but it was finally starting to feel like hers again. When her ex-husband Michael had first left, even though he had gone 1,000 miles away to Indiana, she had felt afraid in her house like he might suddenly come back. And so she'd actually had Cindy sleep over at her house for a while to help her feel safe. And also, she asked Roy to literally nail all her windows shut. But despite fortifying her living space, what Susan couldn't escape from were all these awful little notes that Michael had left behind and hidden all over the house. All these awful messages, just basically telling Susan all these terrible things about her and how much he hated her. She kept finding them all the time. But as of right now, the house was neat and tidy. And Susan by this point believed she had found almost every note, or certainly close to every note. So, to celebrate, Susan headed over to the couch and sat down and turned on the TV. Her plan was just to watch a couple of shows and just enjoy the peace and quiet and then go to bed because tomorrow she would have to get up early for work. As she was sitting there flipping through the channels trying to figure out what she wanted to watch, she heard a knock on the front door. 2 days later, at 6 p.m. on the afternoon of July 28th, Susan's father, Joe Atkins, was at home when his phone rang. And when he picked it up, it was Susan's manager at the sandpaper factory, which was weird. The manager told him that he was calling because Susan had not shown up to work for the past 2 days and nobody could get a hold of her, and so he was wondering if Joe knew where she was. Joe frowned and said, no, he didn't know, but he would go find out. He hung up and he immediately dialed Susan's number. And when she didn't answer, he didn't think twice. He just put the phone down, grabbed his keys, hurried out to his truck, and started driving towards Susan's place. A half an hour later, Joe pulled up outside of Susan's house, and he went up to her front door. And when he knocked, nobody answered. But he could hear the TV on inside. And when he tried the doorknob, he found the door was unlocked. He opened the door up a little bit, and he poked his head inside and he called his daughter's name, but he didn't get a response. So, he stepped all the way inside. The house was basically clean, except there were snacks out on the coffee table and the TV was still on, and it was on pretty loud. But also, there were some cigarettes that had been burned out in an ashtray on the coffee table, and Joe knew his daughter didn't smoke. And so at this point, everything told him something was wrong. So Joe walked through the living room and into his daughter's bedroom. His daughter was not in there, but the bed was a mess. The sheets and the bedding had all been ripped off and were sitting in a heap on the floor, and the mattress itself was hanging off the box spring. Joe was about to leave and search the rest of the house when he noticed the bathroom door in the bedroom was open. Joe forced himself to step toward the door, and as he did, his heart began to hammer in his chest. And then when he leaned around the door and looked inside the bathroom, he just froze. For what felt like a very long time, but was very likely only a few seconds, Joe didn't move or breathe. Then it's like he broke out of his fog. He stumbled backwards. He ran to the living room, grabbed the phone, and he called 911. Sergeant Donnie Hensley of the Stephenville Police Department had just gotten home after a pretty long shift when he got a call from dispatch to head back out again. A homicide had just been called in, and every available officer had to head to the scene right away. The dispatcher did not have many details, but they did know that the victim was a young woman and that she had been found by her father inside of her home. When Hensley got to the address, he found there was an ambulance there and a couple of fire trucks and police cars and a whole bunch of police officers that were already out and about stringing up crime scene tape. But he also saw someone that he was not expecting to see. It was a friend of his, a guy he knew who volunteered at the town's golf course. His name was Joe Atkins. So he walked over and he asked Joe, hey, what are you doing here? But the instant he asked that question, and when Joe turned around to look at him, Hensley understood why he was here. He suddenly remembered that Joe had a daughter. And based on the look on Joe's face, clearly his daughter was the murder victim. Joe had found her. Hensley was a hardened detective who had been to plenty of crime scenes by this point, and he had seen some terrible things. But the pure grief on his friend's face was too much for him to bear. He knew there was nothing he could do to take Joe's pain away. So instead, without saying anything, Hensley took Joe's hands, and the two men just stood there and prayed. And then, after a few minutes, he let go of Joe's hands. And then he turned and walked up Susan's front steps to begin the search for her killer. The crime scene unit was already inside of Susan's home, hard at work by the time Detective Hensley walked through the front door. A supervisor walked over and brought Hensley up to speed. They told him that Susan's body was in the bathroom, and from the looks of it, she'd been dead for a while. The front door had been unlocked, and there was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that Susan may have let her killer inside. Detectives were now dividing up the house into quadrants to examine each part of the crime scene, and Hensley would be working primarily in the bedroom. But the supervisor warned Hensley that the crime itself was incredibly brutal, likely bordering on torture, and he should just mentally prepare himself. Hensley nodded, and for a moment he just stood there and collected himself and took stock of the scene. He looked over at the coffee table in the living room, and he saw it was covered with snacks, including a bag of potato chips, a pack of Twinkies, and an open Coke can. And there was an ashtray with 6 cigarette butts inside of it. It looked like more food and more cigarettes than one person would reasonably consume. And so maybe Susan had had company. But otherwise, the house was clean and pretty unremarkable, except for one thing that took Hensley a minute to notice. And what it was is all the windows were nailed shut from the inside. Susan clearly must have been scared of somebody breaking in. And so naturally, Hensley wondered if maybe the person she was scared of breaking in was the same person who wound up killing her. But if that was the case, why had she apparently opened the door for this person? At this point, Hensley moved into the bedroom. And as soon as he did, he could tell there had to have been a struggle in here because the mattress was hanging off the box spring, the sheets had been pulled off, and they were heaped up on the floor. And there were all these scuff marks on the floor that suggested the bed very likely had been moved, dragged around inside of the room. There was also a white extension cord lying on the mattress. And also there was this pillow that had all these strange black smudges on it. Hensley walked over and looked at this pillowcase, trying to figure out what the smudges could be, and then he realized it was mascara. The pillow must have been held over Susan's face to suffocate her. But when Hensley walked into the bathroom and saw what was in there, despite the warning he was given about how brutal it was, he still was taken aback and found himself gasping. Susan's body was draped over the side of the tub with her head still in the water. At first glance, it was obvious Susan was dead because her head and shoulders that were underwater were severely decomposed from being in the water. And so at this point, Hensley realized that whoever murdered Susan had likely sexually assaulted her, strangled her, smothered her, and then held her body underwater. This had been a savage attack committed by a monster. However, Hensley also realized that this monster, whoever had done this, had made at least one mistake because one of the crime scene techs that was in the bathroom was pointing at the tub with excitement. And when Hensley looked at what they were pointing at, you could see perfectly clearly there was a set of palm prints almost certainly left behind by the killer. The following morning, at around 10 a.m., Sergeant Hensley walked into the Stephenville police station and promptly filled up a paper cup from the bullpen water cooler and drank it down. It was over 90 degrees outside, and he had just spent all morning and a lot of the previous night canvassing the neighborhood where Susan had been murdered. But despite all their efforts, they really hadn't gotten much. Susan had been found on Tuesday, but nobody had reported seeing her on Tuesday or the Monday before or the Sunday before, which left a window of 3 days for this murder to have taken place. One of Susan's neighbors did remember seeing a, quote, large-framed man park his truck near Susan's house on Sunday night, but that described a lot of the men in Stephenville, so that didn't really narrow anything down. Now, the police chief had not yet assigned a lead investigator to Susan's case, but because Sergeant Hensley knew Susan's father personally, he was hoping to stay involved. So, after drinking a second cup full of water, Hensley headed down the hall to the chief's office where he asked to see Susan's autopsy report. The chief's secretary handed it over, and Hensley quickly began to thumb through the pages, but he quickly realized there really was almost nothing here that he didn't already know. The report confirmed that Susan had been sexually assaulted, but her body was so decomposed it was impossible to determine exactly how or when she had died. Although the coroner estimated she'd been in the tub for roughly 2 days. But right at that moment, another investigator named Lieutenant Ken Maltby walked up and grabbed the report right out of Hensley's hands. And before Hensley could protest, Maltby walked back to the bullpen and rapped his knuckles on a doorframe to get everybody's attention. Then Maltby announced that he would be taking over Susan's case. So everybody else, Hensley included, should back off. And Hensley did not like this. Not only because he had this closeness with Susan's father, but also because he had a feeling that Maltby was only interested in this case because he thought it would help his career. However, Maltby outranked Hensley, and Hensley already had a full caseload of work. So there really was very little he could do here. So, with a resigned sigh, he headed back to his desk. 2 days later, around 2 p.m. on July 31st, Sergeant Hensley stood in the back of a small crowd, sweating through his suit as Susan's casket was lowered into the ground. Hensley was at this funeral really to support Susan's father, Joe, because he was not really a part of the investigation. However, he couldn't help scanning the mourners through a detective's lens to see if anybody seemed suspicious. There was a group of people in their 20s and 30s that were standing towards the front, and Hensley assumed they must be Susan's friends. He remembered what one of Susan's neighbors had said about a large framed man, and he looked at all the men, taking note of their size. At the center of the group, there was a blonde woman who was sobbing. And Hensley recognized her as Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, who was leaning on her boyfriend, Roy Hayes. The two of them had actually come to the crime scene by coincidence on the day Susan's body was found, and they had totally broken down when they realized what had happened. But now, Hensley was suddenly noticing just how physically enormous Roy was. And so in that moment, Hensley thought to himself, if he was in charge of this case, he knew Roy would be somebody he'd take a close look at. But that was not his decision. But then Hensley noticed that there was actually one person who was conspicuously absent from this funeral, and that was Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. From what Hensley had heard around the station, nearly all of Susan's friends and family were convinced that it was Michael who was the killer. But there was a problem with this theory. Michael lived 1,000 miles away in Indianapolis. And word around the police station was that during that window of time where Susan was murdered over those 3 days, Michael was in Indianapolis and he was around loads of people who would vouch for him being in Indianapolis. Which meant that as far as Hensley knew, there really was no way for Michael to be the killer. And so Hensley just hoped that Lieutenant Maltby had another better suspect in mind. For the next few weeks, Sergeant Hensley focused on his own cases while still keeping tabs on Susan's. Every couple of days, her dad would call him up and ask why Michael hadn't been arrested yet. And Hensley would always tell him that the case was in good hands, and they're working on it. But as the weeks passed by with no arrests, Hensley started to wonder, what was going on here? Something needs to happen. Why is nothing happening? Then, one day in early October, so roughly 2 months after Susan's murder, Hensley walked into the bullpen to find Maltby celebrating. Not because of any progress in the case, though, but to celebrate his big promotion. Maltby was going to be the lead of a new narcotics unit, and his open cases that he had been working on were just going to be given to other investigators or filed away altogether. And so as Maltby accepted congratulations from other officers and just made a whole scene, all Sergeant Hensley could think was, well, what's going to happen to Susan's case? It could easily fall through the cracks here. And so without even talking to Maltby, Hensley walked straight to the chief's office and asked to take the case over. The chief shrugged and just said, sure, you're welcome to try so long as this case does not get in the way of his other work. Hensley agreed and then went to get Susan's file. And then, after he had it in hand, he hurried back to his desk and began rifling through the pages. And he was stunned to find that there was almost nothing in there besides the original autopsy report. And that's when Hensley remembered that Lieutenant Maltby claimed to have this photographic memory. And so he almost never took notes. And so Hensley was basically going to have to start all over from square one. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Hensley sat down in the kitchen of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, as Cindy poured them both a cup of coffee. And then Cindy started talking. And she had a lot to say. She was absolutely convinced that Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, was the killer. And she just could not understand why it was taking detectives so long to arrest him. Cindy said, for most of Susan and Michael's relationship, Michael was just kind of a loser. He couldn't keep a job, and he'd just lift weights and play guitar shirtless in the front yard. However, when they had broken up, Michael had recorded this totally unhinged audio recording about how awful Susan was and left it for Susan, along with all these notes he had hid all around the house and the property, which also just said terrible things about Susan. And this behavior by Michael had scared Susan so much that she had asked Cindy and Cindy's boyfriend Roy to help nail all her windows shut, specifically to prevent Michael from coming into the house. Hensley listened and wrote everything Cindy said down, but he really wasn't as sold on the Michael Woods theory as everybody else in Stephenville seemed to be. And that was primarily because the police in Indianapolis had spoken to Michael, and apparently he had given them a rock-solid alibi. And so, realistically, it didn't make sense for him to be the killer. That said, Hensley was pretty confident that the killer had to be somebody Susan knew. The lack of forced entry, coupled with all the snacks and the Coke can and cigarettes on her coffee table, suggested that Susan might have entertained her murderer before they killed her. And so at this point, Hensley was much more interested in learning if there were other romantic interests in Susan's life, besides Michael. And when he asked Cindy that question, she said, yeah, there was one other guy. She said right before Susan was killed, she was seeing this bartender named J.C. Bowman. However, they'd only gone on a few dates. Cindy said that J.C. had put a lot of pressure on Susan to sleep with him, and so she had just broken up with him. And when Hensley heard this, he felt like this was really promising. And so when Cindy finished telling her J.C.'s story, he asked her if she knew where he could find J.C. And she said, yeah, and she gave him the address of the bar where he worked. 45 minutes later, Sergeant Hensley pulled up in front of the bar. It was still too early for business, but there was a delivery truck out front, and there were a few men who were unloading kegs and bringing them inside. And so Hensley walked up to these guys, and he asked if any of them knew a J.C. Bowman. And this tall, bearded man raised his hand and said, actually, that was him. A few minutes later, Hensley and J.C. were sitting at the empty bar. Hensley watched J.C.'s face very closely as he explained to him that he was here to talk about Susan. J.C. nodded and ran his fingers through his hair like he was nervous. And then he said his throat was dry and asked Sergeant Hensley if he wanted something to drink. Sergeant Hensley said he was okay. But J.C. got up, went behind the bar, and then came back with a can of Coke. And after sitting down and opening the drink up and taking a sip, J.C. also lit up a cigarette. And so immediately, Hensley thought of the Coke can that was on Susan's coffee table, as well as the ashtray full of cigarettes, despite the fact that Susan was not a smoker. And so the interview had barely even started, and Hensley was already very suspicious of J.C. So he decided to push pretty early and see how J.C. reacted under some serious pressure. And so right out the gate, he asked J.C. where he was on Sunday, July 26th, which was the day investigators at this point believed Susan was murdered based primarily on the autopsy report. And when J.C. was asked that, he swallowed and said he couldn't remember, which was possible. I mean, the murder happened 2 months earlier, but it didn't make J.C. look that good. So Hensley asked J.C. if it was true that he and Susan broke up ultimately because he, J.C., had pressured her for sex. J.C. turned beet red and said he had never pressured Susan. He said they had been intimate, but just once in Susan's bathtub. And when Hensley heard this, he nearly dropped his pen. It seemed extremely suspicious that J.C. was claiming to have been intimate with Susan in the same bathtub where she was found dead. And so Hensley wondered if he was maybe trying to get ahead of the fact that his fingerprints would be found on or in that bathtub. Now, legally, Hensley knew he could not compel J.C. to offer up his fingerprints without charging him first, but he took a chance and just asked anyway. And to his surprise, J.C. said, yes, you can have my fingerprints, and he almost seemed relieved. He said, whatever you need to help solve Susan's murder, I'll do it. 2 hours later, Sergeant Hensley was back at his desk in the Stephenville police station looking at a card that had J.C.'s finger and palm prints on it. And as he looked at it, he began thinking about those palm prints on Susan's bathtub. In 1987, fingerprints and palm prints were just much slower to process than they are today. And the closest lab that analyzed these prints was an hour and a half away in Fort Worth. And Hensley knew they were always working with a backlog. So his results could easily take months. But Hensley was not going to just sit around and wait, because he had one more suspect he wanted to talk to. The following afternoon, Sergeant Hensley walked into an interrogation room at the police station and sat down across from Roy Hayes, who was Susan's best friend, Cindy's boyfriend. Hensley wanted to speak to Roy for two reasons. One, he matched the physical description of the large man seen near Susan's house around the time of her murder. And two, there just weren't that many people who were close to Susan, and Roy saw her when she was both with Cindy and also when she would attend those members of the Round Table get-togethers. Now, that was not that incriminating, but Hensley knew that catching the killer was as much about ruling suspects out as it was about ruling them in. So, that was really all he was trying to do here with Roy, is just maybe find a way to say, nope, not him. But before Hensley could even begin asking Roy questions, Roy just started talking. He told Hensley that he had been thinking about Susan's case nonstop. He said that his mind had been running wild with all the possible ways the killer could have gotten inside. And so now Roy was eager to share his theories. After all, he said he was the one who nailed those windows shut. So he knew where the weaknesses in her house were. And so Hensley said, "Okay, let's hear your theories." And Roy began listing all the ways a person might be able to get inside of Susan's house, including what Roy said was the most promising, which was a 6-inch crack in the window above the kitchen sink. And as Roy did this, all of a sudden, he was at the top of Hensley's suspect list. And when Roy was done rattling off all the ways he would break into Susan's house, Hensley asked him, "Where were you on the evening of Sunday, July 26th, and Hensley watched as Roy's expression changed from very intense to surprised as he realized he was now being asked for his own alibi. Roy started stumbling over another very long, rambly answer, and what he had to say ultimately just made him look even more guilty because Roy told Hensley that on the night Susan was killed, he had been over at a friend's house playing a game called Dungeons & Dragons. So today, people know Dungeons & Dragons as a harmless fantasy role-playing game. But at this time, in 1987, it was viewed very differently. In the late 1980s in America, there was this huge fear that certain games, books, and heavy metal songs were all linked to devil worship. The TV news ran regular stories across the country about how Dungeons & Dragons specifically encouraged players to cast spells and practice witchcraft. And the local paper in Stephenville had carried a full-page ad calling the game satanic. So when Roy told Hensley he had been playing Dungeons & Dragons on the night Susan was killed, Hensley immediately thought back to the horrible brutality of the crime scene. And he wondered if maybe Susan's murder could have been tied to some kind of dark ritual. And so Hensley looks at Roy and says, "Okay, well, are you prepared to give us your fingerprints?" And Roy said, "Yeah." A half an hour later, a very disappointed Sergeant Hensley watched Roy walk away from the station. Just like with JC, Roy had seemed incredibly suspicious at the start of the interview, but then he'd easily offered up his fingerprints like he wasn't concerned at all about whether they'd match the killers. So Hensley was not sure what to expect in terms of results here. But he still sent Roy's prints off to the outside lab to be added to the queue behind JC's. Hensley was contemplating his next move when the station receptionist walked over and said that someone from the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department was on the line for him. They were following up on the inquiry he had made a few days earlier to double-check the alibi of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods. Hensley eagerly ran to the phone, and when he heard what the officer had to say, he practically jumped out of his chair. Because according to the Indianapolis police officer, it was true that Michael said he had an alibi with lots of witnesses, but he had promised to provide the names and contact information for all those witnesses, and he had never done it. Which meant Michael's alibi, the same one Stephenville police used to rule him out as a suspect. Or, more specifically, they used the idea of his alibi, the belief that his alibi existed. That's what they used to rule him out. Well, clearly it was totally... Lieutenant Ken Maltby, who was in charge of the case when this decision was made, had just completely dropped the ball. Somebody had to check Michael's alibi. On a bright morning in April of 1988, Sergeant Hensley walked out of the Indianapolis International Airport with a single duffel bag of luggage slung over his shoulder. He was here to try to collect the fingerprints of Susan's ex-husband, Michael Woods, who was now Hensley's primary suspect. Hensley had been trying to coordinate the investigation into Michael from Stephenville, Texas, but it had proven to be kind of cumbersome, and so he decided to just take matters into his own hands and actually go to Indianapolis. He knew Michael did not have to submit to fingerprinting unless he was charged with a crime. So Hensley had come up with a plan. He was going to put Michael under surveillance and wait for him to do something illegal. Maybe he gets into a fight or an altercation, or he buys some marijuana, or even jaywalked, anything. Hensley would use it as an excuse to arrest him and get his prints. For days, Hensley sat in an unmarked van outside the house where Michael lived, watching the front door through a telephoto camera lens. But Michael and his roommates seemed pretty boring. They barely even left the house. Hensley was beginning to think that his big plan to catch Michael doing something illegal was a huge waste of time. It just was not going to happen. But then, one morning, he noticed some unusual activity in Michael's front yard. Michael and his roommates were laying out furniture and clothing on their front lawn, clearly getting ready for a yard sale. Sergeant Hensley was snapping photos of everything they were bringing out. And at one point, he saw something that gave him a rush of excitement because, through his lens, he spotted these crystal figurines that appeared to be the exact same type of crystal figurines that Michael had allegedly stolen from Susan's house in Stephenville when their marriage had ended and he had left to go to Indianapolis. Hensley practically laughed out loud. I mean, this was too easy. This was his chance. So he called the local police, and they stormed the yard sale, and they arrested Michael for theft. 2 weeks later, now back in Stephenville, Sergeant Hensley walked into the police station to start a shift, and he found a manila envelope waiting for him. It had a return address that said it was from the Texas DPS crime lab in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had sent all of the suspect's fingerprints. Hensley ripped open the envelope and dumped the contents onto the table. And as he began looking through them, he realized the lab had already analyzed all 3 sets of prints that he had sent in. They were Susan's ex-boyfriend, J.C. Bowman, her best friend's boyfriend, Roy Hayes, and her ex-husband, Michael Woods. Now, at this point, if Hensley had had to guess who the killer was, he would have guessed Michael. Because Michael is this enraged ex-husband who had left behind these terrible recordings and notes, and he had spooked Susan so badly at the end of their relationship, she had nailed her windows shut to keep him out. And then also, his alibi was sort of up in the air. They didn't really know if he had one or not. They hadn't been able to actually verify it or not yet. JC also had basically no alibi. He drank Coke and he smoked cigarettes just like the killer had left in Susan's living room, or is believed to have been the killer who left those behind. And Roy, in virtue of playing Dungeons and Dragons, could potentially be involved in Satanism. And also, he seemed way too eager to talk about how he might break into Susan's house. However, for Hensley, he felt like one of these 3 men is the killer. He's about to get his answer. But as he read through each of these reports, he went from exhilaration to confusion and finally just total disbelief because none of these prints that he'd submitted matched the ones from Susan's tub. Hensley wanted so badly to solve this case, to give Susan's father, Joe, his friend, some closure, but now he felt like he was totally out of ideas. Susan's case ultimately went completely cold. Sergeant Hensley retired and 19 years passed by. And then one day, in early 2006, Lieutenant Don Miller of the Stephenville Police Department took a box labeled Susan Woods down from a shelf in evidence storage, carried it back to his office, sat down at his desk, and began to look through its contents. Miller had recently been tasked with reviewing the department's unsolved cases, including Susan's. He read all of Sergeant Hensley's notes. He studied the crime scene photos, and he reviewed all the witness statements. None of it looked very promising. In fact, it looked like all the suspects had basically been ruled out. But then he saw those palm prints that had been lifted from Susan's bathtub, which had never been matched to anyone. And he had an idea. Back in 1987, there had been no centralized database of fingerprints. This meant that unless you had a specific suspect to compare an unknown print against, the unknown print was effectively useless. And that's really what had happened in Susan's case. None of the suspects had matched this unknown print. So, the case was put on a shelf. But in 2006, the FBI now had a national database of all the fingerprints of everybody in America who had ever been arrested and fingerprinted. And this meant that if Susan's killer had ever been arrested for any crime anywhere, their fingerprints would likely be in that database. Now, Lieutenant Miller did not have the budget or the time for a full-blown reinvestigation here. But he certainly had the time and money to just submit those prints into this FBI database to just see if there was a hit. So he submitted them and then put her case file back in storage. And sure enough, a few days later, Miller was at his desk when his phone rang, and it was the FBI, and they told him they had found a match. But when the FBI agent told Miller the name of the person whose prints these matched, it meant nothing to Miller. He didn't think he'd actually even heard the name before, and the person had been arrested for robbery in Nevada, not Texas. Miller thanked the agent, and he quickly began digging through this person's history, and he also went and got the Susan Woods case file. And slowly but surely, it all began to come together. And as Miller read through in her file all the names of the people that Susan spent her time with, he noticed something. And finally, it all just clicked. Lieutenant Miller had found the killer. Based on evidence collected at the crime scene and the killer's written confession, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Susan Woods on the evening of Sunday, July 26th, 1987. Stephenville's main street was busy as the killer drove through town in their brown pickup, sipping a mixture of soda, vodka, and cough syrup. They stared out their window at all the happy people in the restaurants and the storefronts. And as they stared at these people, a darkness stirred inside the killer. This darkness had been there for years, telling the killer they were no good and they would never be close to anyone. Alcohol was the only thing that seemed to make this darkness go away. So, the killer stayed half drunk most of the time. But sometimes, even the alcohol wasn't enough. A few years back, when the TV news had been running non-stop with talk about devil worshipping, the killer had been sort of inspired, and they thought they might try that. And so, they had lit a bunch of candles and set them around their room in the shape of a pentagram. And then the killer stripped off their clothes. They stretched out on the floor and they offered up their soul to the devil in exchange for freedom from this darkness. But unfortunately, the darkness remained. And so now the killer, feeling very riled up, took another drink and thought of Susan and the way she'd smiled at them the last time they had seen each other. The killer had not had the courage to make a move back then. But now, with this buzz that they had from their drink, they really couldn't see a good reason not to make a pass at Susan. So they turned off the main road, and they drove the short distance to Susan's house. In a matter of minutes, the killer was at her door, knocking. Susan opened the door, and surprise flashed across her face, but then it softened into a smile, and she told them to come on in. Susan told them to get comfortable, and as they sat down on the couch, she went to the kitchen to get the killer a Coke and some snacks. Then she brought them back, and she sat down on the couch next to the killer to talk and catch up. And that was when the killer made their move. They leaned in to kiss her, but Susan immediately pulled back. Suddenly angry, the killer grabbed her and Susan slapped them across the face. And right then, the killer exploded. It would take almost 20 years. But that single action of the killer placing their hands on the bathtub did eventually give Lieutenant Miller the killer's identity. He was the younger cousin of Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark. And he was one of the members of that roundtable group who supported Susan through her divorce. He had also been at Susan's funeral and helped her friends through the aftermath of her death. The killer's name was Scott Hatley. And just a week before he killed her, he had been hanging out with the members of the roundtable. And Susan was there. And Susan, who was this, very shy, gentle person, had sort of opened up around this group. She was feeling happier and happier, largely because this group of friends, including Scott, had been so supportive. She really felt like she belonged here and was safe here. And during that meeting amongst the members of the round table, just sort of inexplicably, Susan had looked over at Scott and simply smiled at him. And for that reason, pretty much alone, Scott, a week later, had shown up on her doorstep and murdered her. By the time Lieutenant Miller put all of this together, Hatley was 41 years old and was still a free man. And so, on the 7th of June 2006, Miller had him arrested and charged him with Susan's murder. He would ultimately take a plea deal and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but would only serve 11 years before he was released for good behavior. However, 3 years after Hatley got out of prison, he was found dead inside of his RV from cancer complications. And among his things, investigators would find this handwritten diary where he confessed to Susan's murder. The pages were also filled with references to Satan and demons. And Hatley specifically wrote that some kind of outside presence had been responsible for pushing him to ultimately assault and kill Susan. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.
In early 2020, a very popular Russian Instagram influencer named Ekaterina Didenko was getting ready for a huge... It was her 29th birthday, and she wanted to do something memorable, something that would look amazing on social media. Ekaterina and her husband, Valentin, decided to throw a party at a well-known spa in Moscow, Russia. They planned everything out, inviting a close group of their influencer friends to join them. The idea was to rent out a private section of the spa, one that came with its own steam room and a small, intimate indoor swimming pool. It was the perfect backdrop for the kind of content their followers loved to see. Once the reservations were locked in, the excitement started to build online. Ekaterina and her friends began posting about the upcoming party, teasing their followers about the big day, and hyping up the event across all their social media accounts. When February 28th finally arrived, the day of Ekaterina's birthday, the whole group was buzzing with energy. Ekaterina, her husband, and the 8 friends they had invited all made their way to the Moscow spa. They were led to their private area, and it was exactly as they had imagined. There was food laid out, drinks were flowing, and music was playing. Right away, people started having a great time, jumping into the pool, relaxing in the hot tub, and just enjoying the atmosphere. Of course, since they were all influencers, the phones were out immediately. Everyone was taking pictures, filming videos, and even live streaming parts of the celebration. From the outside, it looked like the perfect party, a glamorous event going exactly as planned. Then, at a certain point in the evening, Ekaterina's husband, Valentin, gave a subtle signal to the rest of the group. Everyone except Ekaterina knew what was coming. They started to pull out these large white bundles. As they unfolded them, it became clear what they were. Full-body, hazardous materials, suits. The kind you'd see in a movie about a chemical spill, complete with masks and hoods. One by one, the guests started putting them on. They handed one to Ekaterina, telling her it was all part of her big birthday surprise. Now, it's not entirely clear if Ekaterina was genuinely surprised or if she was just playing along for the cameras. After all, a dramatic reaction would make for better content. Either way, she put on the white hazmat suit just like everyone else. Once the entire party was dressed in these bizarre-looking outfits, Valentin wheeled in a huge cooler, the kind you'd take on a camping trip, and he positioned it right at the edge of the indoor pool. The cameras were all pointed at him. With a dramatic flair, he unlatched the lid and threw it open. A massive cloud of thick white smoke immediately billowed out, pouring over the sides of the cooler and spreading across the floor. The guests all gasped and cheered, laughing as they filmed the spectacle. Inside the cooler was about 55 pounds of dry ice. Dry ice, as you probably know, is just carbon dioxide frozen into a solid state. It's incredibly cold and is often used to keep things refrigerated for a long time. But it's also famous for the visual effect it creates. When dry ice warms up, it doesn't melt into a liquid like regular ice. Instead, it turns directly from a solid into a gas, a process called sublimation. This releases huge clouds of white carbon dioxide gas, which looks a lot like a spooky fog. This was Valentin's plan. He wanted to dump all of this dry ice into the pool to create a stunning visual effect covering the entire surface of the water with this thick rolling fog. It would look incredible on Instagram. Now, dry ice is considered hazardous if you don't handle it properly. The partygoers were all wearing these hazmat suits, but it's very unlikely they were wearing them for actual safety. It was more of a gimmick, a prop, to make the stunt look more dramatic and exciting for their social media feeds. So, with everyone watching and filming, Valentin and another one of the guests grabbed the large cooler. They tilted it forward and dumped the entire 55 pounds of solid dry ice directly into the swimming pool. The second the dry ice hit the relatively warm water of the pool, it began to sublimate at an incredible rate. There was an almost explosive release of carbon dioxide gas. A massive, dense white cloud instantly erupted and filled the entire lower half of the room, completely obscuring the pool. None of the partygoers seemed worried at all. They were laughing and filming, thinking it was the coolest thing they had ever seen. They had no idea of the danger they were in. To them, this was just the peak of the party. Caught up in the moment, Valentin, Ekaterina's husband, took a running leap and jumped straight through the cloud of gas, disappearing into the water below. A moment later, two other guests, a man and a woman, followed his lead and also jumped into the pool. The thing about dry ice that makes it so dangerous in a situation like this is the carbon dioxide gas it releases. In high concentrations, especially in an enclosed space with poor ventilation, that gas displaces oxygen. It literally pushes the breathable air out of the room. This small private pool area was exactly that, a small, confined space with very little air circulation. The 7 people who were still standing on the pool deck filming the scene quickly started to realize something was wrong. It suddenly became very difficult to breathe. The air felt thin, and they started coughing and gasping. The oxygen was being rapidly sucked out of the room. Fortunately for them, they were still on their feet and close to the exit. They managed to turn and stumble out of the room just before it was too late. But for Valentin and the 2 other people in the pool, there was no escape. When they came up to the surface to take a breath, they weren't breathing in oxygen. They were breathing in an almost pure lungful of concentrated carbon dioxide gas. In addition to displacing oxygen, carbon dioxide is also toxic to the human body at such high levels. As soon as they inhaled the poisonous gas, 2 of them lost consciousness almost instantly and slipped back under the water. Valentin, however, managed to stay conscious just long enough to desperately try and save himself. He struggled to climb out of the pool, his body already failing him. He barely managed to pull himself onto the deck and tried to crawl towards the door, but he collapsed before he could make it. The other partygoers eventually dragged him out and emergency services were called, but it was too late. He was rushed to the hospital but would later die, not just from the carbon dioxide poisoning, but also from the severe lack of oxygen to his brain. The other 2 people who had jumped into the pool with him were pronounced dead at the scene. A birthday celebration designed for social media had turned into a horrific tragedy, all of it captured on video. On Saturday, the 30th of September 2017, a staff member at a country club in North Wales was doing their regular rounds when they noticed something a bit unusual. They saw water leaking from the bottom of an outside wall of one of the club's bungalows. These bungalows were charming, single-story white buildings scattered across a beautiful green hillside. They were mostly used as vacation rentals for guests looking for a quiet getaway. The staff member who spotted the leak didn't think too much of it at first. Leaks happen. They simply turned around, walked back to the main office, and reported it to their boss. A short time later, 2 maintenance workers were dispatched to go and check it out. So, these 2 workers made their way over to the bungalow in question. They walked up to the front door and gave it a few firm knocks. They waited for a moment, but there was no answer. Silence. Figuring the guests might be out, they pulled out their master key and unlocked the door. As they did, one of them called out as a precaution, something like, "Maintenance, we're here to check on a water leak." It could be an emergency. They pushed the door open and stepped inside. The bungalow was quiet. To their left was a small kitchen area, and to their right was a living room. It was essentially one large, open-plan space. They called out again, just in case someone was in another room, but still, there was only silence. The workers walked straight through the main living area, heading towards the back of the bungalow. They came to a closed door, which they assumed led to the bedroom. Given the leak was coming from this side of the building, it made sense that the source would be in the adjoining bathroom. They knocked on the bedroom door, another standard precaution, but once again, no one answered. So, they turned the handle and opened it. Inside the bedroom, they saw two twin beds pushed up against the right-hand wall. At the foot of these beds, in the middle of the room, was a pile of luggage. The bags were all zipped up and unopened. To the maintenance workers, this was a clear sign that someone was definitely staying here. Either they had just arrived and hadn't unpacked yet, or they were packed and ready to leave. But wherever they weren't in the bungalow right now. The workers carefully made their way around the luggage and the beds, walking along the left side of the room. At the very back, there was another closed door. This one, they knew, led to the ensuite bathroom. Based on where the leak was appearing on the exterior wall, they were almost certain the problem was in this bathroom. So, they approached the door and knocked one last time. Still nothing. They opened the bathroom door, and immediately they saw what they were looking for. The floor was covered in water. But as they looked around, they were a bit confused. The sink wasn't overflowing. The shower wasn't running. The toilet looked fine. None of the usual culprits seemed to be the source of the flood. There was, however, one other place in the bathroom the water could be coming from, the airing cupboard. An airing cupboard is essentially a small closet usually found in homes in the UK that houses the hot water heater. People also typically install shelves in there to store towels and linens, using the warmth from the heater to keep them dry. In this bungalow, the airing cupboard was located right inside the bathroom with its own separate door. This door was positioned immediately to the left of the main bathroom door. The workers reached over and pulled the handle. The door to the airing cupboard swung inward. And the moment it opened, they knew exactly where the leak was coming from. And they also knew with a sickening certainty that they were dealing with a problem far, far worse than a simple water leak. 7 days earlier, a 60-year-old retired policewoman named Mary Isherwood had arrived at that very same bungalow at the North Wales Country Club. For many years, she and her ex-husband had co-owned the property. They rarely used it themselves, instead treating it as an investment and renting it out to vacationers. But recently, they had made the decision to sell it. Before the sale was finalized, Mary told her ex-husband that she wanted to spend one last week there to finally enjoy the property for herself. The original plan was for her to go with a group of friends, but at the last minute, her friends had to cancel. Mary was undeterred. She decided she would just go on her own and enjoy the peace and quiet. Mary arrived at the country club late at night. She let herself into the bungalow, dropped her luggage in the bedroom, and, instead of settling in for the night, she decided to get some exercise. Mary was an incredibly fit and active person. She loved to play golf, go for runs, and stay in shape. She knew the club had a swimming pool, so she dug a bathing suit out of her luggage, changed, and went for a late-night swim. When she returned to her room, she took a quick shower and then got into one of the twin beds. She preferred to sleep without any clothes on, and that night was no different. Sometime in the middle of the night, Mary woke up needing to use the bathroom. She got out of bed, walked the few steps to the bathroom door, and went inside. After she was done, she turned to go back to her bedroom. In the pitch-black darkness, she reached out for the door handle. But instead of grabbing the handle for the bedroom door, her hand found the one for the airing cupboard, which was right next to it. She turned the knob, opened the door, and stepped inside. The cupboard was completely dark. As she took a step forward, the door swung shut behind her with a soft click. She probably bumped into the shelves and realized immediately that she had made a simple mistake. This wasn't the bedroom. She turned around to open the door and let herself out, but as she grabbed the doorknob from the inside, it crumbled in her hand. The old, worn mechanism broke into several pieces and fell to the floor in the darkness. Suddenly, a silly mistake had become a very serious situation. Mary was in a tiny, pitch-black closet. The broken pieces of the doorknob were scattered on the floor, and she had no way of seeing how to put them back together. She likely knelt down, feeling around for the pieces, trying desperately to reassemble the knob by touch, but it was an impossible task. The horrifying reality of her situation must have set in. She was staying in the bungalow, completely alone. She wasn't scheduled to check out for another week. No one was expecting to hear from her. No one would come looking for her. And without a doorknob, the heavy wooden door was impossible to open. The latch was firmly in place. Mary started to panic. She began banging on the door with her fists and screaming for help at the top of her lungs. But her bungalow was a standalone building, not connected to any others. Her voice and the sound of the banging didn't travel far. No one heard her. After hours of this, the initial shock and terror began to wear off, replaced by a steely determination. Mary was a former police officer. She wasn't one to give up. She decided she had to find a way out. She turned away from the door and faced the back of the small cupboard. In the darkness, she felt her way to the shelves that were in front of the hot water heater. She grabbed onto one of the wooden shelves and began to pull and twist with all her might until it broke free from the wall. Now she had a tool, a makeshift club. She turned back to the door and tried to smash it open, but she quickly realized the solid wood was too strong. So she changed her tactic. She started striking the wall right next to the door, the drywall. She found that she could break through it. It was slow, grueling work, but she was making a hole. Her new plan was likely to create a hole big enough to reach her arm through and open the door from the outside. But the progress was painfully slow. She needed a better tool. She turned back towards the water heater and broke away a few more shelves, clearing a path for herself. She squeezed past the remaining supports until she was standing right in front of the heater itself. By touch, she felt around for the copper pipes connected to it. She found one, got a firm grip, and started yanking on it with all her strength. She pulled and twisted until a section of pipe ripped free from the heater. She now had a much better tool, a solid piece of metal pipe that would be far more effective at digging through the wall. But in breaking the pipe, she had created a new and much more immediate problem. The moment the pipe broke, cold water started spraying out of the hot water heater, flooding the tiny cupboard. There was no way for Mary to avoid it. She was instantly soaked in a continuous stream of shockingly cold water. It was a miserable and painful experience, but she was focused on survival. She had her tool. She would just have to endure the cold and dig herself out. With freezing water raining down on her, Mary returned to the hole she had started next to the door and began to dig again, smashing and tearing at the drywall with the piece of pipe. She worked for hours, fueled by adrenaline and the will to live. But then, she hit something solid. The pipe clanged against it. She felt through the hole. It was a brick wall. The bungalow's exterior wall was right behind the drywall. There was no way through. She couldn't reach around to the outside of the door. It was a dead end. Devastated and exhausted, she stopped. The cold water was still pouring down on her, and the first stages of hypothermia were likely setting in, but even then, she didn't give up. She made one last, desperate attempt. She turned and faced the other interior wall, the one that separated the airing cupboard from her bedroom. She started digging again, smashing the pipe into this new wall, hoping she could burrow a hole large enough to crawl through to safety. For several more hours, she dug and clawed at the wall, periodically stopping to scream for help and bang on the door. Eventually, she broke through to the other side. She had made it into her bedroom. But in a final cruel twist of fate, as she pushed the pipe through the wall, it didn't emerge into open air. It hit another hard, flat surface. What she couldn't have known in the dark was that a large, framed picture with a glass cover had been screwed to the wall on the bedroom side, right over the exact spot where she had been digging. In her exhausted, panicked, and hypothermic state, she felt this new obstacle and must have believed she had hit another dead end, another brick wall. The reality was, she could have easily smashed through the picture frame and made the hole big enough to escape. But in that moment, her hope was finally extinguished. She slumped to the floor of the cupboard, the cold water still washing over her, and accepted her fate. 6 days later, when those two maintenance workers opened the airing cupboard door, they found Mary's body. She had died of hypothermia. The investigation later revealed that other guests in nearby bungalows had heard banging sounds coming from Mary's unit on the Saturday night she got trapped, and again on the following Sunday morning, but no one reported it. They just assumed it was construction noise. One couple, however, did think the banging was strange. They told each other that if they still heard it by 5 o'clock on Sunday evening, they would call the front desk to report it. As it happened, Mary, exhausted and succumbing to the cold, stopped banging right around 5 p.m. on Sunday. The couple, hearing the noise stop just as they were about to make the call, assumed the problem was over and forgot about it. It's impossible to know how long Mary survived after that point. It could have been minutes, hours, or even days. Her family would later sue the country club for negligence, but the final outcome of that case was never made public. On the 30th of July, 2013, a 5-6-year-old man named Roger Miro was at home in his apartment. He gathered up a bag of trash from his kitchen, walked out into the hallway, and turned right. He walked a short distance down the hall to the trash chute, which was built into the wall. He pulled open the little metal door, which looked a bit like a mailbox, dropped his trash bag inside, and let the door close. He then turned around and walked back to his apartment. As he stepped back inside, he did what many of us do instinctively. He reached into his right pocket to grab his cell phone. But it wasn't there. He checked his left pocket. Nothing. He patted his back pockets, then started searching more frantically. He quickly realized his phone was missing. His first thought was that he must have just set it down somewhere inside his apartment. Now, Roger was legally blind, which made finding small objects like a cell phone a particularly challenging task. But he began to search anyway. He started in the kitchen, carefully running his hands over all the countertops and surfaces. No phone. He moved on to the living room, then the bedroom, and finally the bathroom, checking every conceivable spot. The phone was nowhere to be found. So Roger started to think about his short trip to the trash chute. Maybe, he thought, the phone had slipped out of his pocket and fallen on the floor in the hallway. He left his apartment again and carefully retraced his steps, running his hand along the wall and feeling the floor as he went. He made it all the way to the trash chute, but there was no phone on the ground. As he stood there in front of the chute, a new, dreadful possibility occurred to him. What if his phone had been in the trash bag? What if he had just thrown his own cell phone away? As Roger was contemplating this, one of his neighbors came out into the hall and saw him standing there looking concerned. The neighbor asked him what was wrong, and Roger explained the whole situation with his missing phone. The neighbor had a helpful suggestion. He told Roger to go down to the first floor and ask the building manager for the key to the main trash room. That's where all the garbage from the chutes collected. Roger thanked him, made his way to the elevator, and went down to the first floor. He found the manager's office and knocked on the door. When the manager answered, it was clear he was in the middle of something important. Roger explained his problem, saying he thought he might have accidentally thrown his phone away and just wanted to take a quick look in the trash to see if he could find it. Now, the building had a strict policy about the trash room. It was considered a hazardous area, and residents were not allowed to go in there by themselves. The manager was supposed to accompany any resident who needed to retrieve an item. But at that exact moment, the manager was waiting for a very important phone call and couldn't leave his desk. He felt bad for Roger, though, and decided to bend the rules. He told Roger, "Look, I'll just give you the key. You can go in there yourself and look for your phone. Just bring the key back when you're done." Roger thanked him, took the key, and made his way down the hall to the trash room. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. A few hours later, Roger's wife came home from work. She walked into their apartment and was surprised to find it empty. Roger wasn't there. She tried calling his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She looked around the apartment for a note or any sign of where he might have gone, but there was nothing. This was very unusual. Roger rarely went out on his own, especially at night. A feeling of deep unease washed over her. Acting on pure instinct, she called the police and reported her husband missing. A short time later, 2 police officers arrived at the apartment building. They went up to Roger's apartment, spoke with his wife, and then began knocking on neighbors' doors. One of the neighbors they spoke to was the same man who had seen Roger earlier. He told the officers about the lost phone and said that the last he knew, Roger was heading down to the trash room on the first floor to look for it. The officers immediately went downstairs and found the trash room. The door was unlocked. They pushed it open and looked inside. The room was a stark, windowless concrete space. In the very center of it stood a huge industrial green dumpster. High above the dumpster, on the ceiling, was a large, round opening. This was the bottom of the trash chute that serviced the entire building. All the trash that residents dropped in from their floors came tumbling out of that hole in the ceiling and fell directly into the dumpster below. But this was a very specific type of dumpster. It wasn't just an open-top container. The top was almost completely sealed shut with welded metal. The only opening was on the left side, which was positioned directly under the hole in the ceiling. Welded onto this opening was a short, nearly vertical metal tunnel, like a funnel, designed to catch the falling trash and guide it down into the dumpster. There was about a 3 or 4 foot gap between the top of this funnel and the ceiling. As the officers scanned the room, they noticed a ladder had been propped up against the side of the dumpster right next to this metal tunnel, as if someone had used it to look inside. One of the officers walked over, climbed the ladder, and peered down into the dark tunnel. And there, at the bottom, inside the dumpster, he found Roger. After a long and difficult investigation, police were able to piece together what had happened. After Roger got the key from the manager, he went into the trash room and found the huge dumpster. He would have quickly figured out that the only way to search for his phone was to look down through that metal tunnel. He found the nearby ladder, propped it against the machine, and climbed up. He was leaning over, peering down into the darkness, when he lost his balance. It's possible a bag of trash came down the chute from above and struck him, or maybe he just slipped. Either way, he tumbled forward and fell headfirst down the tunnel and into the dumpster. What Roger could not have known was that the moment he fell in, he was trapped. This wasn't just a dumpster, it was an industrial trash compactor. When he fell, his body landed on an electronic sensor at the bottom. This sensor was designed to automatically activate the compactor whenever enough trash had accumulated. Inside the dumpster, a massive hydraulic ram was set into one wall. When activated, this ram would slowly but powerfully press all the way across the container, crushing all the trash against the opposite wall before retracting. Roger, being legally blind and likely dazed from the fall, would have had no idea what was happening until he heard the terrifying mechanical groan of the machine starting up. He was in complete darkness, with the sound of a hydraulic press moving towards him. He probably tried to scramble back up the tunnel he had fallen down, but its walls were smooth and nearly vertical. There were no handholds, no ladder inside. There was no way to climb out. Inside the dumpster itself, there was no emergency shutoff switch and no emergency exit. Realizing he couldn't climb out, Roger's only option was to retreat to the far side of the dumpster to get as far away from the advancing metal wall as he could. But once he was pressed against the back wall, there was nowhere left to go. He was forced to simply wait as the hydraulic press moved slowly across the container until it finally reached him. It's not known for sure if that first cycle of the compactor was what killed him. What is known is that Roger was trapped inside that machine for several hours before he was found. During that time, other residents of the building continued to throw away their trash. Each time a bag fell down the chute and hit the sensor, the compactor would activate again and again. By the time the police officer looked down into the dumpster and saw a part of Roger's body, it was immediately clear that there was nothing anyone could do. Roger's wife would go on to sue the building manager and the company that owned the apartment complex for their negligence in his death. However, the final outcome of that lawsuit has never been made public. These stories all began in ordinary places, with ordinary decisions, and ended in ways no one could have ever seen coming. The real question is this: at what exact moment do you think things started to go wrong? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, sometimes the smallest choices lead to the biggest consequences. In the very early hours of the 27th of March 2003, a 4-year-old boy was lying in his bed in a small farmhouse in rural Ohio. He heard his bedroom door creak open. He figured it was probably just his great-grandparents, Jack and Linda, coming in to check on him like they sometimes did. So, being a little kid, he just squeezed his eyes shut and pretended to be sound asleep. He heard the floorboards groan as whoever it was walked slowly across the room. He could hear them getting closer and closer. And then the sounds stopped. They were standing right next to his bed, looking down at him. He could almost feel them there. His curiosity got the better of him. He opened his eyes just a tiny crack, just enough to peek. But what he saw standing there in the dark was not his great-grandmother or his great-grandfather. It was a huge green monster. On the evening of Wednesday, the 26th of March 2003, a 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers was driving her car down a quiet, 2-lane road in Darkey County, Ohio. Darkey County was the kind of place that was mostly made up of very small towns, separated by huge stretches of farmland. It was peaceful. As Linda drove, the sun was setting over a wide-open field, casting long shadows across the road. She was on her way home from the pizza shop that she and her husband Jack owned together in a nearby town. It was a normal end to a normal day. Eventually, Linda turned off the paved road and onto a long gravel driveway. This led to the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and Jack lived. She parked her car in front of their old farmhouse, a place that felt like home in every way. She reached into the back seat and grabbed the deposit bag. It was full of the cash earnings from the pizza shop for that day. She got out of the car, and the quiet of the countryside settled around her. The farm was so isolated that you couldn't hear any traffic from the main road. The only sounds were the sheep bleating softly in the pasture and the hum of power tools coming from the big barn out back. She walked around to the back of the barn, and there was Jack. He was hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car, tinkering away. Jack and Linda had been married for about 7 years. This was Linda's third marriage, but with Jack, she truly felt like she had found her soulmate. He was a hard worker. On top of co-owning the pizza shop with Linda, he also had a full-time job at a manufacturing plant. And as if that wasn't enough, he ran a side business restoring classic cars. Linda often found him out here working on a car as the sun went down. It was just who he was. Sitting in the grass next to the car, playing with a small wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. The moment Damien saw Linda, his face lit up with a huge smile. He dropped the wrench, jumped to his feet, and ran over to give her a big, tight hug. Seeing Damien's happy face always made Linda feel a little bittersweet. Damien was the son of her granddaughter, Amber. But Amber had gotten pregnant when she was only 14 years old. She was just a child herself and wasn't in any position to raise a baby. So, Linda and Jack had stepped in. They offered to take Damien and raise him for a few years, just until Amber could finish high school and get her life on a stable track. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, and it came with its own set of problems. One of the biggest problems was Damien's father. He was furious about being cut out of the custody agreement and having limited access to his son. Even now, 4 years later, he still argued with Linda about it. He would insist that he wanted to be a part of Damien's life, but Linda was worried. She had a deep fear that he would eventually just abandon the boy, and she couldn't bear the thought of her great-grandson going through that kind of pain. So, she kept him at a distance. Besides, Linda thought Damien was going to have another father figure in his life very soon. In the past few years, Amber had really turned her life around. She had finished school, she had met a wonderful new man, and they had gotten married. Their plan was to take Damien in and raise him themselves as soon as he finished his current year of preschool, which was only a couple of months away. Linda was incredibly proud of Amber and how much she had matured. But she also felt a pang of sadness. She and Jack were going to miss having Damien around the farm. They loved him more than anything. In many ways, he was like their own son. Linda could see that Jack was completely focused on the car engine and probably didn't want to be interrupted. So she just said a quick hello to him, then scooped Damien up into her arms and carried him toward the farmhouse. She opened the back door, set Damien down inside, and told him to go wash his hands for dinner. Then she walked into the kitchen and tossed the deposit bag from the pizza shop onto a chair in the dining room. The bag was full of cash, and her plan was to take it to the bank first thing in the morning. Linda got a pan out and started cooking dinner. A few minutes later, her husband Jack came inside, his hands and arms covered in car grease. While Jack washed up at the kitchen sink, Linda asked him how his day had been. Jack just grumbled a bit. He was annoyed about a customer he'd sold a car to on a payment plan the year before. The customer had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out to the guy's house the next day and repossess the car. Linda could tell Jack was tense, but she knew it wasn't just about the missed car payment. The truth was, Jack had been on edge for the past week or so. It all started after he had a huge argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been a shy, mild-mannered kid who was really close with his dad. He had even been the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding. But recently, Greg's life seemed to be falling apart. He was going through a messy divorce, he was struggling with drinking and drug abuse, and he had been skipping shifts at his job. Earlier that month, Greg had come to the farm asking Jack for money. He said his house was about to be foreclosed on. But Jack had decided it was time for some tough love. He drew a line in the sand and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he needed to clean up his act and get back to work. That conversation had turned into a massive fight. Now, Linda had a feeling that Jack was genuinely worried he had done permanent damage to his relationship with Greg. He was probably afraid that history was repeating itself. Something similar had happened with Jack's other son, Travis, about 7 years earlier. When Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into an argument that was so bad, Travis packed his bags, moved out, and they hadn't spoken a single word to each other since. 7 years of silence. Linda thought Jack must be terrified that the same thing was about to happen with Greg. So, while Jack stood at the sink, scrubbing the grease from his hands, Linda came up behind him and gently rubbed his shoulders. She told him not to worry so much about Greg. She said Greg had a good head on his shoulders and just needed a little push to get back on the right track. That's all Jack had done. She reassured him that he'd made the right decision and that Greg would get through this rough patch. After that, Linda set the table and called everyone for dinner. A little while later, after they had all eaten and cleaned up the kitchen, Linda glanced up at the clock. She realized it was getting pretty late. Damien had preschool in the morning, and she didn't want him to be tired and cranky. So she picked him up and carried him upstairs to his room to get him ready for bed. She helped him change into his pajamas, brushed his teeth for him, and then tucked him into his bed. She gave him a kiss on his forehead, whispered good night, and quietly closed the door behind her. Linda went back downstairs. Before long, she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. A short time later, Linda was in their bedroom. She had a small lamp on. She changed into her own pajamas and crawled under the covers. Once Jack was settled in beside her, she reached over and turned off the light, and the room went dark. Soon, they were both fast asleep. But several hours later, in the middle of the night, Linda was jolted awake by a horribly loud noise. She shot up in bed, her heart pounding. She looked around the dark room, trying to figure out what had happened. When her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she saw something that made her gasp. The next morning, at a church just a mile away from Linda and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting her classroom ready for the day. As the children started to arrive, she noticed there was one empty chair. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Huffman, was late. This wasn't totally unusual. She knew Damien's great-grandparents were busy people. They ran a farm, a pizza shop, and a car restoration business. She figured they were probably just running a little behind schedule. So she started the class as usual, hoping they would drop Damien off before he missed too much of the day. About an hour later, around 9:30 in the morning, she was leading the class in their morning sing-alongs. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open and Damien came sprinting inside. At first, the teacher was just relieved to see him. But then she got a closer look. Damien looked frazzled and he was out of breath. He wasn't wearing his backpack. He was still in his pajamas. And there was a smear of something dark and brown on the front of his shirt. She immediately ran over to him and knelt down. As she got closer, she realized the brown spot on his shirt was dried blood. The teacher's heart sank. She gently asked Damien what was going on. He looked up at her with a scared and confused expression on his little face. He told her that his great-grandparents' faces were melting. About 15 minutes after that, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker and his partner were driving their patrol car down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective with the Darker County Sheriff's Department for 5 years, and he was the head of the investigative unit. When the department got a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was the one sent out to see what was going on. The preschool teacher on the phone had sounded frantic. She said a 4-year-old student named Damien Huffman had shown up for school alone, covered in what looked like blood, and was saying something bizarre about his great-grandparents' faces melting. The teacher gave the police the names of the great-grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, and their address. Whitaker had no idea what a 4-year-old boy could have meant by that strange phrase, or what kind of scene he and his partner were about to walk into, but he had a very bad feeling about it. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel driveway. When Whitaker got out of his car, the first thing he noticed was how eerily quiet it was. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more scattered on the horizon, but otherwise they were surrounded by nothing but empty fields. It felt completely isolated. Whitaker started walking towards the front of the farmhouse. As he got closer, he saw that the front door was already wide open. He didn't see any obvious signs of a forced entry, like a kicked-in door or a broken lock, but it was still unsettling. Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons. They stepped carefully over the threshold and into the house. Whitaker called out, announcing their presence, asking if anyone was home. But there was no response. The only sound was the wind whistling through the open door. From where he was standing in the entryway, he could see another open door across the room. It led to a set of stairs going down, probably to a basement. Whitaker decided to ignore the basement for now and focus on clearing the main floor first. He and his partner moved cautiously through the house. They went into the kitchen. It was empty. Once they were sure it was clear, they continued down a hallway until they found a doorway that led into a bedroom. Whitaker pushed the door open and stepped inside. And that's when he found them. Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers, were lying in their bed side by side. It was obvious from the moment he saw them that they were both dead. Jack was lying on his stomach. Whitaker could immediately see a large dark wound on the back of Jack's neck. It looked like a bullet wound. Linda was lying on her back. She had gunshot wounds on her face and on her hand, as if she had raised her hand in a last desperate attempt to defend herself just before she was shot. At this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full, systematic search of the rest of the house just to make sure the killer wasn't still hiding somewhere inside. The house was empty. So the two of them returned to the master bedroom to begin the difficult task of processing the crime scene. Whitaker pulled on a pair of latex gloves and gently touched the wound on Linda's face. The blood was still warm and wet to the touch. Based on that, he figured they had likely only been dead for a few hours at most. He scanned the floor around the bed, looking for bullet casings. He couldn't find any. This told him something important. It meant the killer had been careful. They had taken the time to pick up the spent casings afterwards to cover their track. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned. Then, Whitaker's partner called his attention to something strange. There was a weird, plasticky bundle lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker carefully picked it up. It was a piece of quilting fabric that had been wadded up into a ball and then covered in layers of masking tape. He turned it over in his gloved hands. His best guess was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer had probably taped it to the end of their gun to try and muffle the sound of the gunshots. It must have been blown off when they started firing. This immediately raised a question in Whitaker's mind. If this was a silencer, why would a killer even need one? They were out here in the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighbors were far away, but then he remembered who else was in the house. He left the bedroom and went up a flight of stairs. The room directly above where the murders had taken place was another bedroom. This one was filled with stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And that's when it clicked for Whitaker. The killer must have known there was a toddler sleeping right upstairs. They needed the silencer because they didn't want to wake the child when they committed the murders. And this meant one thing for sure. The killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was personal. Within minutes, more officers from the Darke County Sheriff's Office arrived and began to swarm the property. Whitaker went back outside to supervise them as they set up a perimeter and started their search for evidence. Pretty quickly, a forensics officer called him over. They had found a set of footprints in the soft mud near the side of the house. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints, which led them around the side of the house to a small basement window. The window pane had been carefully pried off, leaving an open hole just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and peered through the opening. Inside, he could see a set of stairs leading up to the main floor of the house. This had to be how the killer got inside. It also explained why that basement door had been standing wide open when they first entered the house. This discovery only made Whitaker more certain that the killer was someone close to the family. They obviously knew the layout of the house. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a plaster cast of the footprints. With any luck, it would tell them the type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. As Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The phone lines that ran along the side of the house had been cut. The wire was cleanly severed. The killer had planned this meticulously. They had made sure that no one inside the house would be able to call for help. Just then, a pickup truck pulled up at the end of the road. A woman got out and started walking hesitantly toward the house. Whitaker quickly walked over to intercept her, making sure she didn't get too close and contaminate the crime scene. He asked her what she needed. She explained that she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said she had seen all the police cars and didn't know what was going on, but she thought she had some information that might be helpful. The neighbor told Whitaker that around 4:30 that morning, she had been awake and had seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been too dark for her to see the color of the minivan, but the vehicle itself had stuck out in her memory. As far as she knew, the Myers family did not own a minivan. Hearing this, Whitaker realized this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. If that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened sometime before 4:30 in the morning. This was a potentially huge piece of the puzzle. He thanked the neighbor for her help. After she left, Whitaker went back inside the house to look for more clues. He really wanted to figure out a motive. He was convinced that whoever did this knew Jack and Linda, but that didn't explain why. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Was it revenge for some old grudge? He didn't know. As he walked through the house, he found that deposit bag full of cash that Linda had brought home. It was sitting in plain sight in the living room. It hadn't been touched. There were also some expensive electronics in the living room, a TV, and a stereo system that were also untouched. This pretty much ruled out robbery as a motive. So Whitaker went back upstairs to take another closer look at the toddler's bedroom. As he scanned the room, he noticed something odd. On the child's bedding, there was a small reddish-brown stain. It looked like a spot of dried blood. While forensics teams were still carefully combing over every inch of the farmhouse, another investigator on the case, a man named Detective Mike Burns, drove to the local preschool. His task was to speak with the only potential witness, 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate wave of sympathy for this little boy who was sitting in a small office looking scared and utterly confused. He knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for Damien to talk about something so traumatic, but he was their best hope of figuring out what had happened to his great-grandparents. Burns sat down on the floor with Damien in a private room. He spoke in a soft, calm voice and asked the little boy to try and explain what had happened that morning. Damien, in the simple way that a 4-year-old talks, said he had woken up around 8:45. The house was very, very quiet. So, he got out of his bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. He said they were both in their bed, and at first, he just thought they were sleeping. But when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move. Then, he saw that there was blood on their faces. He said he tried to wipe the blood off with some Kleenex wipes, but there was just so much of it. He realized then that something was very, very wrong. He said he thought for a moment that their faces were melting. And so, thinking he needed to get help for them, he had run the entire mile down the road to his preschool. Burns was amazed that a child so young could remember and articulate so much about such a horrifying experience. He was also grateful. The boy's story explained why there was blood on his pajama shirt. But it still didn't explain the small spot of blood they'd found on Damien's own bed. So, Burns asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room at any point after finding his great-grandparents. But Damien shook his head and said no. He said he went straight out the front door and ran to his school. Burns felt like there had to be more to the story. He just couldn't explain how that bloodstain got onto Damien's bed. So, he brought over a dollhouse and some small toy figures. He asked Damien if he could act out everything that had happened the night before, using the toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien took the toy that represented himself and put it into a bed in one of the dollhouse rooms. Then he put the Jack and Linda toys into the bed in the other room. He said that everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtime. But then, he said, later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open. He said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was. Damien paused for a long moment, and then he said, "The green monster." At first, Burns wasn't sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just describing a nightmare or if his imagination was running wild. But then, Damien put the toys down. To represent the green monster, he used his fingers, and he made them crawl across the floor of the dollhouse, moving slowly toward his own bed. Damien explained that he had heard the door to his room open, and he had opened his eyes just a tiny bit. He didn't want whoever it was to know he was awake, so he was just squinting. And when he did that, he saw the green monster standing right next to his bed, and the green monster was pointing a gun at him. Damien said he was so scared that he squeezed his eyes shut as tight as he could and just pretended to be asleep. And then, when he finally dared to open his eyes again, the green monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's memory was almost certainly not a dream. It was all too real. More than likely, Damien had come face to face with the person who killed his great-grandparents. They were the green monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, a 19-year-old named Amber Holscher. So, the detective drove out to Amber's house in a nearby town. When he rang the doorbell, she answered right away. At this point, no one in the family had been officially notified about the murders, so Amber had no idea why a detective was suddenly standing on her doorstep. Burns knew this would be difficult, so he gently asked if he could come inside to speak with her. Confused, Amber said, "Okay," and let him in. They sat down in her living room. Then Burns told her as gently as he could that her grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. When Amber heard this, she just looked confused. She asked what he meant. "Where are they?" she asked. Burns took a deep breath and had to clarify that they were deceased. Amber looked completely shocked. Her eyes filled with tears, and the first thing she asked was, "Is Damien dead too?" But Burns quickly reassured her. He told her that Damien was alive and safe, but that he was going to be kept in protective custody for a while. They were worried that whoever killed Jack and Linda might try to hurt Damien too. And until they had a suspect, Damien would not be allowed to see anyone in the family, including her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just broke down and started to cry. Burns felt terrible for her, but his main focus was on Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as possible. Every day that went by was another day that Damien would have to spend alone without any family to comfort him. Based on Amber's genuine shock and her immediate concern for her son, Burns felt it was highly unlikely that she was involved. Damien also hadn't mentioned seeing his mother at the farmhouse, but she might know something that could help them. Once she had calmed down a bit, Burns asked her if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. Right away, she nodded. She mentioned Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because Linda wouldn't let him see Damien. In fact, she said, just recently, Andrew had shown up at Linda's pizza shop and had started a big fight with her about custody. The argument had gotten so heated that Andrew had publicly threatened to kill Linda. This immediately caught Burns's attention. It provided a clear and powerful motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, Andrew would have a much easier time getting custody of Damien, so he thanked Amber for her help and promised he would be in touch soon. The moment he got back to his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and told him what he had learned. Later that day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they got there, Andrew came to the door and let them inside. He sat down and looked at them, waiting for them to explain why they were there. They told him that Linda and Jack had been murdered, and they watched his reaction very closely. He seemed surprised, but he definitely did not seem upset or sad. Andrew openly admitted that he did not get along with Amber's family. And when Whitaker asked him about the big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew didn't deny it. He admitted that he had, in fact, threatened to kill Linda. But he swore he would never actually do something like that. He said it was just an empty threat made in the heat of the moment. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew seemed very suspicious. So, he asked him for an alibi for the night of the murders. Andrew said he had stayed over at a girl's house that night. In the morning, he had stopped by his dad's house, and then he had gone straight to work. He told them they could ask all of those people, and they would all confirm his story. Whitaker wrote all of this down. He asked Andrew a few more questions, and then thanked him for his time. As soon as the detectives left Andrew's house, they immediately went to go check on his alibi. They drove to the girlfriend's house. Then they went to Andrew's dad's house. And finally, they went to his place of work. And every single person at all three locations confirmed Andrew's story. His alibi was solid. Unless all of them were lying, there was simply no window of time where Andrew could have driven 2 hours to Ohio, murdered Jack and Linda, and then driven back. Whitaker was disappointed. They had basically wasted most of the day chasing a lead that now looked like a dead end. And he was very aware that every moment this case went unsolved was another moment that little Damien had to spend all alone away from his family. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and his mother, was sitting in his office feeling very frustrated. He had one main goal for the day. He wanted to find and interview Jack's estranged son, 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was proving to be much harder than he had anticipated. The day before, other sheriff's deputies had interviewed Linda and Jack's family and friends. Several family members had mentioned that Travis and his father Jack had some very bad blood between them. When Burns had looked into Travis's background, he found that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a big problem. It seemed like Travis hadn't even been in the state of Ohio for the last 7 years. The last anyone in the family had heard, he had moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually had no idea where Travis was. There was no other address on record for him. So, Burns basically had no way of finding him. He decided his best bet was to start by visiting Travis's younger brother, Greg. Burns knew Greg lived only a few towns over, and even though he wasn't sure how close the two brothers were, it was the only lead he had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a young man in a baseball cap opened the door. It was clear from his red, swollen eyes that he had been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers. The young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg didn't seem surprised by the visit at all. He said the police had already called him the night before to tell him about his father and stepmother's murders. He said that since then, he'd just been waiting for an officer to come by and talk to him. He said he'd seen enough TV shows to know that family members were always the first suspects. But as they walked into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks. There was another young man standing in the doorway, and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was. Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He had come here hoping to maybe get a lead on where Travis might be. He never imagined he would just find Travis standing right there in Greg's house. This was a huge development. Until this moment, Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg explained that Travis had actually been in Ohio for the past several weeks. He had been staying in an apartment he had rented nearby. Burns thought the timing of this seemed incredibly suspicious. It was just too convenient that Travis had come back to town for the first time in almost a decade, right before his estranged father and stepmother were killed. It just seemed too perfect. And something about the scene just felt off. The two brothers just standing there waiting for the police to come and question them. It didn't sit right with him. So Burns, acting on a gut instinct, told them both that he needed to question them formally. He said they would have to come with him down to the station. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns led Greg and Travis Myers into the Dark County Sheriff's Office. Neither of the brothers was under arrest yet, but Burns had a strong feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or both of them might be. Burns took Greg into his office for questioning, while his partner took Travis into an interview room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down, Burns noticed that he wasn't making any eye contact. He was fidgeting and acting shifty. But Greg quickly said that he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted to know if it could help them solve his dad and stepmother's murders. So Burns began asking questions. He asked Greg where he was in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were killed. Greg told him that he was mostly just asleep. That is, until about 4:30, when he got up to go to his job at a factory a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the entire night, and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan. He clocked in at 5:23 in the morning, and he even had a signed time card at home that would prove it. Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan. Remember, the neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 that morning, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, Burns was starting to realize that even if Greg's alibi was a little shaky, the timing alone seemed to rule him out. It seemed basically impossible to drive from Greg's house at 4:30, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive all the way to the factory, and still be able to clock in by 5:23. There just didn't seem to be enough time to do all of that. Also, pretty much everyone in the family had told Burns that Greg was actually quite close with Jack and Linda. Yes, he was having some problems with drugs and alcohol, but he had no history of crime or violence, and none of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So, even though Greg was still technically a suspect, Burns decided to shift his focus to Travis. Burns asked Greg how Travis had reacted when he heard about the murders. Greg said Travis had been upset, but he had mostly been concerned about how Greg was coping, since Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken. He said those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about that big falling out between Jack and Travis. Greg said it all came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money. They had a huge argument that got really ugly. After that, Travis had just quit the family business and moved away. Burns thought about this. He wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died. Because if he did, that would certainly be a solid motive for murder. So, Burns made 2 mental notes. First, check into Greg's alibi more thoroughly. And second, look into Jack's will to see how his assets were supposed to be divided up. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left. He went right down the hall and waited outside the room where his partner was questioning Travis. Later, Burns's partner told him that Travis had seemed really nervous from the moment he stepped into the room. The detective had asked him what he was doing back in Ohio. Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently and realized he had never actually met his brother Greg's children. So, he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then, the detective asked him what he was doing at the time Jack and Linda were killed. Travis stuttered and said he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked if he had anyone who could confirm that. Travis hesitated for a moment and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car. Travis said that at the moment he was driving his mother's car. It was a white minivan. After getting the summary from his partner, Burns went back to his office. By this point, Greg had been moved to a different room. Burns sat down at his desk and began going over the evidence they had collected so far. The investigation had been moving very quickly, so there actually wasn't a whole lot of physical evidence processed yet. It had only been 24 hours since the forensic evidence had been sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for results on just about everything. Burns knew that at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited was to follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. They were the victim's sons, he already believed the killer was close to the family, and they both drove minivans. Really, either of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns's office phone rang. He picked it up. It was a local man who said he had seen a news report about the murders of Jack and Linda Myers. And he had some information that he thought might help. The man said that a few days earlier, a friend of his had called him to ask if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man asked his friend why he needed a gun, the friend said it was because he, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man on the phone told Burns the name of his friend who had said this, and as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who the murderer was. Based on that crucial phone call, as well as the forensic evidence from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of the 27th of March 2003. Early that morning, the killer woke up, got out of bed, and immediately put on a green hunting jumpsuit. They also packed a bag with duct tape, trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun they had purchased from a classified ad just 2 days earlier. They carried all of their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove a familiar route through the dark, open fields of the countryside. They were calm at first, but as they turned onto the long gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm, their heart began to race. The killer felt like they had planned everything out perfectly and had prepared for anything that could possibly go wrong. So now, all they had to do was control their nerves and stick to the plan. The killer parked right outside the farmhouse. Then, while still sitting in the car, they climbed into the backseat of the minivan and grabbed their shotgun. They took a piece of thick quilting fabric, wrapped it around the barrel of the shotgun, and used masking tape to secure it in place. This was their do-it-yourself silencer. But as they did this, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous. As much as they had planned for this moment, it really wasn't something they wanted to do. But they felt like they had to. After their gun had its silencer, they slung it over their shoulder. They got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. Once they were there, they cut the phone lines, making sure nobody inside could call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt, pried open the basement window, and climbed inside. Once inside the dark basement, the killer walked to the stairs. They went up to the first floor and walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. They went inside. There they were, sleeping in their bed. The killer took a deep breath and then raised the shotgun. They fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck. But the force of the gunshot was too strong for the homemade silencer. It blew right off. So the shot wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud. The silencer landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. From the chaos, Linda sat bolt upright in bed. She looked straight at the killer and saw what was happening. She instinctively raised a hand to try and defend herself. In a moment of sheer panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her. They fired twice. One blast went through her hand. The other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and listened. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the next two were incredibly loud. They knew that noise easily could have woken up the third person they knew was in the house. A person they really didn't want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So, just to make sure there were no loose ends, they left Linda in Jack's bedroom, confident they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room. They went inside, carefully walked over to the boy's bed, raised their shotgun, and aimed it at the child, waiting to see if he was awake. But the little boy appeared to be sound asleep. And so, the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun and backed out of the room. Once they were back in the hallway, they shut Damien's door and hurried right out of the house. From there, they got back in their minivan and sped off into the darkness. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and their bloody clothes into a river. Then they changed into their work clothes and drove to the factory, where they clocked in at precisely 5:23 in the morning. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having serious problems with money and drug abuse. His father, Jack, had refused to bail him out, and they had been fighting about it. Greg knew that he would inherit the farm if his father died. And he was so desperate, he decided that murder was his only option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then drive straight to work and clock in by 5:23. His alibi was just barely possible. Greg was arrested about 48 hours after the crime. The investigation moved so quickly that police were still gathering evidence to use against him even after he was in custody. They later found the shotgun, the other supplies, and a pair of shoes that matched the prints found in the mud outside the house, all in a river right near the farm. Fingerprints and store receipts tied all of the items back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he went to live with his mother, Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now grown up and doing very well. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. In 2005, a man named Eric Martin was working his shift at a paper mill in Maine. He'd been at that same mill for 20 years, a long time. It was a normal day, and he was reaching up to get something off a high shelf when he felt a sharp, sudden pain in his back. It was bad. He had slipped a number of discs, and the injury was severe enough that it completely changed his life. The doctors told him he wasn't going to be able to work anymore. He was going to be on disability. And just like that, after 2 decades of the same routine, Eric was out of a job. His wife, Shelley Martin, hadn't been working at the time. She was raising their family. But with Eric's income gone, she knew she had to find a job, and fast. It wasn't easy, since she'd been out of the workforce for a long time. But through some connections, she managed to land a position in her old hometown, a small rural community in Maine called Palmyra. When I say small, I mean really small. We're talking about maybe 1,200 people living there. It was the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, surrounded by miles and miles of dense forest. The Martins also had a 17-year-old daughter named Chelsea. Understandably, she wasn't thrilled about the idea of leaving her friends and her school to move to a tiny town in the middle of nowhere. But the family didn't have a choice. Palmyra was the only place they could afford to live on their new, much tighter budget. But there was a silver lining. Because the cost of living was so much lower in Palmyra, they were actually able to get a bigger piece of property than what they had before. They found this beautiful old farmhouse that sat on a huge plot of land, several acres of it. The catch was, it was incredibly isolated. To even get to the house, you had to drive down a long, bumpy access road that led to their own private driveway. And once you were on the property, if you looked in any direction, all you could see was a 360-degree view of thick, dark woods. There were no hiking trails, no other houses in sight. It was just them and the forest. So, even though nobody was particularly excited about the move, they packed up their lives and headed to the new farmhouse. As they were unloading the truck, Eric picked up one of his many rifles. Eric came from a long line of hunters. It was more than a hobby for him, it was a huge part of his identity. He loved being out in the woods, and he had a whole collection of guns he used for hunting. But as he started to carry a rifle into the house, Shelley stopped him. She said, "Oh no, we're not keeping the guns in the house." This had always been a point of conflict in their marriage. Shelley just never felt comfortable having firearms inside the home, especially with their daughter living there. She told Eric, "You have a barn. You can put your guns in the barn." After some discussion, Eric finally agreed. He went out to the barn with his son Sean, who had come over to help them with the move. Together, they built a heavy-duty gun case for all of Eric's rifles. They made it solid and secure. They put the case inside the barn, locked the case itself, and then locked the barn door. The guns were definitely safe and secure out there, but they were also not easy to get to in a hurry. Over that first year living in the farmhouse, Eric and Shelley settled into a new routine. At the end of each day, they would make coffee and go sit out on the front porch together. They'd just sit there, sipping their coffee and talking, looking out over their front yard and the big open field that stretched out towards the tree line. It was a quiet, peaceful ritual that they both came to look forward to every single night. Fast forward almost exactly 1 year, it was early 2006. Eric and Shelley were on their front porch, having their nightly coffee, just chatting like they always did. The sun had gone down, and it was getting dark. As they sat there, Shelley noticed something. Way out at the edge of the woods, she saw a light. To understand what she was seeing, you have to picture the layout of their property. Right in front of the porch was a gravel area where they parked their cars. About 20 meters or so to the left was the big barn. Straight ahead from the porch was the huge, open field. It was like a grazing area with no trees. And then, hundreds of meters away, at the far end of that field, was the beginning of that dense, dark forest. The light Shelley saw was way out there, at the tree line. She described it as a pulsating light. It didn't look like headlights from a car, and besides, there was no road out there. It was just the edge of the woods. Eric saw it too, and his first thought was that it was a poacher. Someone was on his property, hunting illegally. He was not happy about it. He called for his son, Sean, who happened to be staying the night. He brought Sean outside and pointed toward the tree line. He asked him, "Hey, do you think that's a poacher down there?" Sean looked and said he wasn't sure, but it could be. Eric decided he wanted to go down there and tell whoever it was to get off his land. He asked Sean to come with him. Their plan was simple. They would just walk to the edge of the property and yell out, "Hey, this is private property. You need to leave." So the two of them started walking across the big, open field, heading straight for the distant tree line. As they got closer, they noticed that the pulsating lights began to fade. The lights seemed to be retreating back into the woods, deeper into the darkness. By the time Eric and Sean reached the edge of the forest, the lights were completely gone. Even though they were pretty sure the poacher had left, they decided to be thorough. They thought, just to be sure, let's walk a little ways into the woods and keep yelling. That way, whoever it was would definitely get the message. So they stepped into the forest. It was pitch black under the canopy of trees. The woods were very dense, with lots of low-hanging branches. It wasn't an easy place to walk. There were no paths or trails at all. They walked maybe 10 or 15 meters into the darkness, continuing to call out that this was private land. And then they both stopped. They heard a sound. It sounded like someone or something was walking parallel to them, maybe 15 meters away, off to their left. They could hear the crunch of leaves and the snapping of twigs. They both froze and looked in that direction, but they couldn't see anything in the dark. They didn't want to take any chances. They didn't know if they were being stalked by a mountain lion or some other predator. Eric and Sean looked at each other, and without saying much, they decided it was time to get out of there. The lights were gone, and they didn't like the idea of whatever was making that noise being so close to them in the dark. They turned around and quickly made their way back to the farmhouse. About a month went by after that strange night. It was now spring, and the first really nice weekend after a long, dark Maine winter had finally arrived. Chelsea's boyfriend, Nathan, was staying with the family at the farm. Feeling cooped up, Chelsea and Nathan decided it would be a perfect day to go for a walk in the woods. They took the family's 2 dogs and started walking across that same big field in front of the house, heading towards the same section of forest where Eric and Sean had seen the lights. At first, Chelsea had the dogs on their leashes. But once they got into the woods, she let them off so they could run around and burn off some energy. The 2 dogs immediately took off, running full speed for about 100 meters into the forest. Then, suddenly, they both came to a dead stop. They were standing right in front of a big mound. From a distance, it just looked like a pile of dirt. But as Chelsea and Nathan got closer, they could see it was something more. It looked like some kind of den. Huge pieces of wood had been leaned against each other to create a sort of lean-to structure. The entire outside of it was covered with moss and dirt and grass, making it blend in with the forest floor. It looked like it had been built very intentionally. On the front of the mound, there was a circular hole, like an entrance. The 2 dogs had stopped right at this entrance, and they were cautiously poking their heads in and sniffing. Chelsea and Nathan stood there looking at this strange structure. They wondered who could have built it. Was it something a hunter would make, like a blind? Or could an animal have made it? It seemed way too big and complex for any normal animal they could think of, but it was definitely made on purpose. Nathan, being curious, leaned down and tried to peer into the dark hole. He couldn't see anything inside, but he thought he heard a low growling sound coming from deep within the den. That was enough for him. Without a second of hesitation, he stood up and said to Chelsea, "We have to go." "I don't know what's living in there, but we need to get out of here." They quickly put the dogs back on their leashes and hurried out of the forest as fast as they could. When they got back to the house, they told Eric and Shelley what they had found. Sean happened to be there that day too. They described the strange man-made den they had discovered deep in the woods. As soon as they mentioned where they found it, straight out from the front porch, Eric and Sean looked at each other. That's when they told Chelsea and Nathan about their own experience a month earlier, about the lights and how they could have sworn they heard some large animals stalking them in that exact same area. The pieces of this strange puzzle were starting to come together, and none of them liked the picture it was forming. A couple of months passed. Life on the farm went back to normal, or as normal as it could be. One evening, Eric and Shelley were out on their front porch doing their coffee ritual. It was a cool night, and a low mist was hanging over the entire field, giving the property a slightly creepy vibe. As they were sitting there, they commented to each other about how spooky it looked. But then, their casual conversation took a turn. They both realized at the same time that they couldn't hear any wildlife. There were no crickets chirping, no frogs, no sounds of animals in the woods. Normally, at night, the air was humming with the sounds of nature. But on this night, it was dead silent. Shelley had this high-powered flashlight that she always kept with her on the porch. Feeling uneasy, she picked it up and started scanning the property with the beam. She swept the light across the field, over the barn, and along the tree line. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but the silence was just too odd. After scanning the whole area and seeing nothing, she put the flashlight down and went back to talking with Eric. Eric would later say in interviews that for some reason, the moment she put that flashlight down, a powerful feeling of danger washed over him. He was looking out into the misty darkness, and even though he couldn't see anything, every instinct in his body was screaming that something was wrong. All of a sudden, he turned to Shelley and said, "You know what? We need to go inside." "I don't know what it is, but we need to go inside right now." Shelley was a bit surprised. She said, "Come on, I want to stay out here a little longer. We'll go in a few minutes." But Eric was insistent. He stood up and said, "No, go inside." He tried to grab her arm to gently push her towards the door, but she was still resisting a little. And then, in that moment, Shelley stopped. She froze and whispered, "Did you hear that?" Eric immediately knew that whatever she heard was the reason for his sudden feeling of dread. He turned and looked out into the darkness, but he couldn't see anything. Shelley grabbed her flashlight again and started scanning the tree line. She moved the beam across the field, and when it got about halfway across, right in front of them, she stopped. Because right there, in the middle of the field, illuminated by the flashlight's beam, were 3 creatures. They looked like massive wolves. They were just standing there, staring directly at them. And as they watched, 2 more joined them. Now, there were 5 of these huge wolf-like creatures all lined up in the field, all looking right at the porch. Shelley turned to Eric, her voice trembling, and asked, "What are those?" Eric, an experienced hunter who knew all the animals in the Maine woods, had no idea. He said, "I think they're bears. They could be wolves. We have to go inside." Shelley kept the light on them, frozen in fear. And then the creatures started charging. They ran directly at the porch, moving so incredibly fast that Shelley couldn't even keep the beam of light on them. They were already halfway across the field in a matter of seconds. Eric and Shelley scrambled inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Without even speaking a word to each other, they both went on a mission. They moved through the entire bottom floor of the house, locking every single window and closing every blind. They made sure everything was shut and secured. There was something about these 5 creatures that was different. The way they had charged at them, it didn't feel like a random animal encounter. It felt targeted. It felt like they were after them specifically. So even after the house was locked down, they didn't feel safe. They stood in the middle of their living room, and Eric's mind immediately went to his guns. He said, "My guns are in the barn. We have no protection in here." Shelley immediately told him, "Whatever you do, do not go out there. We don't know what those things are. Don't you dare go out there." Shelley then ran upstairs. She went through the second floor, shutting off all the lights and making sure every window was locked tight. Then she went to her daughter Chelsea's room. She woke her up gently and said, "Hey, come here. You have to look at this." They crept over to Chelsea's window. They didn't want to open the blinds all the way because they were terrified the creatures would see them. So they just peeked through a small crack. Shelley whispered, "Look." And there, standing on the gravel path right in front of the house, were the 5 creatures. They were just standing in a perfect row, looking directly at the house. It was like they were waiting. It was like they knew Eric and Shelley were inside and were just patiently waiting for them to come back out. It was not normal animal behavior at all. As Shelley and Chelsea watched, one of the creatures slowly looked up right at the window where they were hiding. And then the creature stood up on its 2 hind legs. Shelley gasped and stumbled backward, falling to the floor. The creature was enormous. It had to be at least 8 feet tall. Shelley was on the ground, looking up at Chelsea, her mind unable to process what she had just seen. How could it have even seen them? They were barely peeking out the window. And how could it stand up on 2 legs like that? And why were they all just sitting in a row outside their house, waiting? What was happening? Shelley pulled herself together and told Chelsea, "Get in your bed. Do not go near your windows. Do not leave this room." And that's when Shelley realized she hadn't heard their 2 dogs bark once during all of this. She started to worry that they might have been left outside. She began walking quietly through the upstairs rooms, calling their names softly. The dogs didn't come. Finally, she went into the master bedroom, and she found them. The 2 dogs were huddled together in the corner of the room, trembling. They looked completely terrified by whatever was outside. Meanwhile, Eric was pacing downstairs. He felt utterly helpless. He needed to get his guns from the barn to protect his family. But he knew it was a huge risk. With his bad back, he couldn't move very fast. He'd have to cross the open yard, unlock the barn, then pull down the heavy gun case and unlock that, all while being completely exposed to those creatures. He decided there had to be another way. He thought maybe he could run outside, get into his truck, and back it right up to the front door. Then he could get Shelley and Chelsea to run out and jump in, and they could just drive away. He went to a window and carefully pulled the blinds aside, just enough to look outside. The 5 creatures were gone. They were no longer standing on the gravel path. He couldn't see them anywhere. He let the blinds fall back into place. He thought, well, I don't know where they are, so it's still too dangerous to go out there. He started pacing again, his mind racing. After a few minutes, he went back to the window and looked again. This time, he saw them. They were back in the field where he and Shelley had first spotted them. All 5 of them were visible because the moon had come out from behind the clouds, illuminating the whole field. They were still facing the house. Eric thought, okay, maybe this is my chance. If I can keep my eye on them, maybe I can open the door, run to the truck, and back it up before they even notice me. So, without telling Shelley what he was about to do, he quietly unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. He could see them clearly out in the field. They hadn't moved. As quietly as he could, he walked down the porch steps and started making his way across the gravel towards his truck, which was parked about 10 meters away. He kept his eyes locked on the creatures in the field. They still hadn't moved. They apparently hadn't seen him. He reached the driver's side of his truck. He had his keys in his hand and was fumbling to find the unlock button. And then it happened. The motion sensor security light attached to his house kicked on, flooding the entire area with bright light. He was so on edge that the sudden light startled him, and he dropped his keys. The first thing he did was look towards the field. He saw that one of the 5 creatures was now standing on its hind legs, looking directly at him. Before he could even bend down to get his keys, he saw all 5 of them start running towards him at full speed. He dove down, grabbed his keys, and ran for the house as fast as his injured back would allow. He slammed the door shut just as he heard them crossing the gravel right behind him. He heard their heavy bodies bound onto the front porch, and then the sound of them running around the wraparound porch. He was too scared to even look through the window, so he just ducked down to get out of sight. Shelley, who was upstairs, heard all the commotion and yelled down, "Eric, what's going on?" He just yelled back, "Stay up there! Stay up there!" The entire family was frozen. Eric, Shelley, and Chelsea were all just listening, knowing that those creatures were right on the other side of the wall, walking along their porch. After what felt like an eternity, he heard their footsteps leave the porch and go back onto the gravel. At some point, he finally got the courage to peek his head up and look out the window. All 5 of them were sitting there, again, right in front of the house, just facing it, as if they were waiting. Eric scurried up the stairs to where Shelley and Chelsea were. They were all terrified. They decided they had no choice but to call the police. They figured, if nothing else, a police car driving up with its lights on might be enough to scare the creatures away. Shelley made the call. On the phone, she tried to explain that they were scared of something on their property. She said there were 5 creatures, things, running around outside their house. The police officer on the other end of the line was immediately skeptical. He asked, "All right, ma'am, are you sure it's not a moose? Are you sure it's not a bear?" Shelley insisted it wasn't. She pleaded, "Can you please just come over here?" But the officer just said, "Listen, ma'am, just keep your doors and windows shut. I'm sure it'll be fine." And that's how the call ended. They were completely on their own. The family felt helpless. Eric, in particular, was frustrated and angry. He couldn't protect his family. He couldn't get to his weapons. He couldn't get to his truck. They were trapped. They decided the only thing they could do was barricade themselves inside the house. For the next 30 minutes, they worked together, pushing heavy furniture in front of all the doors and windows on the ground floor. They blocked everything as best they could. They went to the kitchen and gathered knives, and they found an axe they used for chopping firewood. With their makeshift weapons, they went upstairs and locked themselves in the master bedroom with their 2 dogs. They all got on the bed together. They decided all they could do now was wait for the sun to come up. During the time they were barricading the house, they had looked out the window from time to time. And each time, they saw the 5 creatures just sitting on the gravel area, waiting for them. But as soon as they finally went upstairs and locked themselves in the bedroom, they heard the creatures move. They heard at least a couple of them walk back onto the porch, and then it was totally silent except for the sounds of these creatures. It was clear they were communicating with each other. They would make strange howling and bumping sounds. It sounded like they were trying to coordinate some kind of attack on the house. The way the farmhouse was built, the second floor was a bit smaller than the first floor. This meant the first floor had its own separate roof that you could walk on right below the second floor windows. After a while, the creatures stopped walking on the porch. They heard silence, and then they heard a loud thud. They had jumped onto that first floor roof. The scary thing about this was that from that roof, you could walk right up to the second floor windows and look inside. So the family was lying there in the dark, listening. Periodically, they would hear them walking on the roof right outside their bedroom. There were windows on either side of the room they were in, with only thin curtains covering them. From time to time, one of the creatures would walk past their window and stop. They would hear it put its paws up on the window glass, and they could see its dark silhouette through the thin curtain. It was looking inside. All night long, they listened to these creatures running around on their roof. Sometimes they would hear a loud, violent scratching sound, as if they had found a weak spot and were trying to claw their way into the house. But after a whole night of this, they never actually broke through the glass. They never got inside. As the first light of dawn started to break on the horizon, the creatures jumped off the roof. The family could hear them running away back towards the forest. For about an hour, they sat in the room listening. They didn't hear anything else. The sun was up now, and they finally felt like it might be safe. They unlocked the bedroom door, went downstairs, and carefully moved the furniture away from the front door. They opened it up and stepped outside. All over their property, there was evidence of what had happened. There were massive footprints in the soft dirt, footprints with huge claw marks at the end of them. They found tufts of dark hair that had gotten caught on fence posts. And even scarier, they found all these spots on the house where the creatures had clearly tried to get in. The siding on the second floor, right by the windows, was shredded with deep scratch marks. The front door had been scratched to pieces. It was undeniable that whatever these creatures were, they had been trying very hard to get inside the house. But for some reason, they had been unsuccessful. This experience was so traumatic for the Martin family that they couldn't stay there. They put the house up for sale and they moved away as quickly as they could. They have never experienced anything like that since they left that isolated farmhouse in Palmyra. So what do you think those creatures were? Were they bears or wolves, or were they something else entirely? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 2014, a young woman named Jen was relaxing in her sister's living room. She was watching her son and her 2 nephews playing outside in the backyard. It was a perfectly normal, quiet afternoon. As she watched them, one of her nephews, a little boy named Harrison, walked over to a big tree in the yard. He started peeling the bark off of it the way kids sometimes do, just mindlessly picking at it. For Jen, seeing this simple act triggered a strange and deeply buried childhood memory. It was something she hadn't thought about in decades. Without even meaning to, she just sort of blurted out what was on her mind. She said, "So weird." Her mother, who was in the next room, heard her. Her mom called out, "Jen, is everything okay?" "What's so weird?" Jen felt a little embarrassed. She hadn't meant for anyone to hear her talking to herself. She quickly tried to brush it off, saying, "Oh, no, sorry. It's nothing." I didn't mean to say that out loud, but it was too late. Her mom was curious now. She walked into the living room and saw Jen looking out the back window at the boys. Her mom came right up next to her and looked out too. She asked, "What are the boys doing out there? Are they getting into trouble?" Jen shook her head. No, it's not the kids. I just saw Harrison doing something that reminded me of a weird thing that happened to me when I was a kid. I just reacted to the memory, that's all. Jen's mom looked at her, totally intrigued now. She said, "Well, you can't just say that and not tell me." "What's the memory?" Jen sighed. She figured she might as well tell her. "Okay, Mom, I'll tell you. I don't know if Frankie's mom ever told you this or not, but it was back when I was 8 years old. I had called my friend Frankie, and he was busy with some homework. He told me to come over and meet him outside his house, and we could go play when he was done." She continued, painting the picture for her mom. "So I walked over to his house. I was standing across the street from his place in front of that little group of trees we used to call the Pinecone Forest. It wasn't really a forest, just a handful of trees, but that's what we called it. Anyway, I was standing there waiting, and I started peeling the bark off one of the trees. I don't even think I realized I was doing it. I was just passing the time. As Jen was talking, the memory became clearer and clearer in her mind. So I'm peeling the bark, watching Frankie's house for him to come out. And then I noticed a guy to my right, walking through the trees, coming towards me. I'd never seen him before in our neighborhood. Even before he got close, I could smell him. He just reeked of stale cigarettes. His teeth were very yellow, and he was missing a few of them. And I remember looking at his hands. I don't know why, but I did. He had these long, pointy, yellow fingernails. They looked like he was growing them out on purpose, all jagged and sharp. He walked right up to me and stopped, way too close, totally in my personal space. But he didn't look at me at first. He looked at the spot on the tree where I had been peeling the bark off. He was maybe a foot away from me. I remember having to lean back because I didn't want to be rude and just run away. All I could smell was that awful cigarette smoke. Then he turned from the tree and looked right at me. He said, "What do you think you're doing?" I was so startled, I just said, "I'm waiting for my friend." He shook his head. "No." "What are you doing to the tree?" I looked at him, then back at the tree and said, "Peeling the bark off." And that's when he reached out and pinched my arm. He didn't use the pads of his fingers. He used those long nails. He dug them into my skin, and through his gritted yellow teeth, he whispered, "How would you like it if someone peeled your skin off?" Jen paused for a moment, remembering the feeling. I was so terrified, I just froze. I was like I was in a trance. I just stood there looking at him, wondering what was going to happen next. Then, just by pure luck, Frankie's mom came out onto their porch and yelled, "Hey, come on inside." Frankie's done with his homework now. That broke the spell. I pulled my arm away and just started running across the street to Frankie's house. I looked back once, expecting him to be chasing me, but he wasn't. He was still standing there by the tree, just watching me. I ran inside, and that was it. I remember wanting to tell you about it when I got home, but for some reason, I just didn't. Then days turned into weeks, and eventually, I guess I just forgot about it. Until just now, when I saw Harrison peeling the bark off that tree, it all came rushing back. That's why I said so weird. I was just wondering who that guy was. Coden. After Jen finished her story, she expected her mom to be horrified, but also to move on pretty quickly. After all, this was an old story from 2 decades ago, and nothing bad had ultimately happened to her. But her mom's reaction was not what she expected. Her mom looked deeply concerned, almost haunted. Jen tried to downplay it. "Mom, this was forever ago." I was 8. It's not a big deal. Her mom looked down at the floor for a second, then looked back up at Jen. There was a look of pure guilt on her face. She said, "Jen, I should have told you this when it happened. But you were so young. I felt like it would ruin your childhood, so I didn't. It seemed like you forgot all about it, so I let it be." But obviously, you didn't forget. I guess you need to hear the whole story now. Jen was completely confused. "What are you talking about?" "What whole story?" Her mother looked incredibly uncomfortable now. She was wringing her hands, touching her face, just radiating anxiety. She told Jen, "It's time you learned who that man really was." Before Jen could even ask another question, her mom just said, "Honey, please just sit down. I'll explain everything." They both sat down on the couch. Jen's mom took a deep breath, clearly struggling to start. "Okay," she began. "So do you remember how our old neighborhood was? How everyone knew everyone? It was such a tight-knit community." Jen nodded. "Yeah, I remember." Her mom continued, "Well, because of that, it was really easy to spot an outsider. If a car I didn't recognize came down our street, I'd find myself looking out the window, watching to see where it was going. There was no reason to be in that neighborhood unless you lived there or were visiting someone. I was always people watching, and I know a bunch of the other moms did the same thing. One of them was Frankie's mom, Sonia. Well, on the exact same day that man approached you in 1995, that morning, Sonia happened to look out her front window. She saw a vehicle she didn't recognize. It was a white work van, the kind with no windows in the back. It was parked across the street, right near the pinecone forest. Sonia figured it was a work truck and that whoever was driving it was probably working on one of the houses. But the spot where it was parked was strange. It wasn't close to any one particular house. There were plenty of other spots to park on the street that would have been more convenient. It seemed odd to park so far away in front of that random patch of trees. That's what made her suspicious. She didn't think anything terrible was happening, she just couldn't make sense of it. So all morning, she kept going back to the window, looking out, waiting to see if anyone would go to the van, but she never saw a soul. No workers going in or out, no activity at all. It was just this empty, silent van parked across the street. By the afternoon, when still no one had claimed it, she was getting ready to call the police. Jen's mom then connected the two stories. That was the same day you and Frankie had talked on the phone. You made plans to meet up near the pinecone forest after his homework. He never told his mom about those plans. If he had, she would have told you to come straight inside and stay away from that van. But she didn't know you were going to be out there. So, sometime in the afternoon, while Sonia is about to call the police, you were already over there by the trees waiting for Frankie. Sonia looked out the window one more time, and that's when she saw it. The back two doors of the van flew open, and that man who pinched you jumped out. He started running straight into the pinecone forest. From where Sonia was standing at her front window, she could only see part of the forest. The other part, where you were, was out of her view to the right. So she turned and ran to a side window in her house. She looked out that window and saw the rest of the forest. And there you were. You were standing in front of the tree, and she saw this man sprint right up to you. She saw him pinch your arm and lean in to talk to you. That's when she ran out onto her porch and yelled for you to come inside. She told me later that she tried to sound as natural and calm as she could. She was worried that if she sounded panicked, it would not only scare you, but it might trigger the stranger to do something drastic, like grab you. She knew he'd been made. So she watched him the whole time you were running to the house to make sure he didn't chase you. As soon as you were safely inside, she told you to go play with Frankie. The moment you were out of the room, she ran around her house and locked every single door and every single window. Then she called me. We both decided we had to call the police. Even though you were safe, we had no idea who this guy was. And the way he came out of that van, it seemed like he was intentionally waiting for you. So Sonia called the police. A cruiser was sent over to the neighborhood right away. The officers found the white van exactly where she said it would be. They pulled up next to it and walked to the driver's side. And sitting inside was a man who matched the description Sonia gave them perfectly. He was acting really weird. He looked like he was on drugs or maybe drunk. Something was definitely off about him. The officers had him step out of the vehicle. They searched the front seats, but there was nothing there besides cigarette butts and old trash. There was a partition wall separating the front seats from the back of the van. They walked around to the back. And they saw that this guy had screwed a heavy-duty latch across the middle of the two back doors. There was a big padlock through it. It was an extra lock, clearly meant to keep people from getting in or maybe from getting out. The police turned to the guy and said they needed to get in the back of his van. They asked him to open it. At first, he made a bunch of excuses, saying he couldn't. But eventually, he gave in. He pulled out a keychain he was carrying. It had two distinct keys on it. He used one of them to undo the padlock. He swung the doors open and stepped back. The police shined their flashlights inside. And they couldn't believe what they were looking at. Jen's mom's voice trembled slightly as she described it. Inside that van, on every single surface in the back, were pictures of you. They were taped to the walls, to the floor, to the ceiling. Everywhere they looked, it was your face. And they weren't just recent pictures. There were at least a couple of you when you were only 6 years old. You were 8 when he approached you. So he had been following you, watching you, for at least 2 years. Also, in the back of the van were a pair of binoculars and a camera, which they assumed he was using to take the photos. But that wasn't even the worst part of it. After they arrested him, one of the officers looked closer at that keychain, the one with the key to the padlock. He noticed the other key wasn't a duplicate. It was a different, unique key. So the police went over to the guy and they showed him the key. They asked him, "What is this for?" And he told them it was for his storage locker. The police tracked down the storage facility and they went there. They used the key on the lock of his unit. It worked. They slid open the heavy metal door, and what was inside was something straight out of a nightmare. The entire storage locker, from the ceiling to the floor to all 4 walls, was completely covered in clear plastic wrap. It was all sealed up. And behind the plastic, on the walls, they could see hundreds more pictures of you. In the very middle of the storage locker was a dentist's chair. It had been bolted and anchored into the concrete floor. Next to the dentist's chair was a small silver tray, the kind you see at a dentist's office. But on the tray, there weren't dental tools. There were knives, not surgical knives. They were meat cleavers and large hunting knives, crude, heavy instruments. Next to that, on a small table, was an anatomy book. He had used printouts of your face to bookmark different pages and sections of the book. He had been taking notes and highlighting passages, all of them having to do with female anatomy. In the back of the locker, there was a rotted mattress just sitting on the ground. And anchored into the back wall were heavy chains with handcuffs dangling from them. And next to the mattress were dozens of empty 5-gallon drums. When the police showed us the pictures of the inside of his van, we were so shaken up. It was awful to imagine someone watching you like that. But when they showed us the pictures of that chamber he had built inside of his storage locker, that's something I will just never get over. He clearly had a plan for you, Jen. A terrible plan. After hearing this story from her mother, Jen was a whirlwind of emotions. She was angry with her mom for keeping such a monumental secret from her for all those years. But she was also incredibly sad. Sad for her mom, who had to carry the weight of that horror, knowing what had almost happened to her child. Now that Jen was a mother herself, she could only imagine how horrible that must have been. So, the only thing she could think to do was to give her mom a hug. After they embraced, Jen pulled back and asked the question that was burning in her mind. What happened to him? Where is he now? Did he go to jail? Her mom told her that the man had confessed to stalking her. He admitted that everything in the van and the storage locker was his, and he seemed to understand the implications of what they found. But he never gave his real motives. He never explained what his actual intentions were. He was ultimately deemed criminally insane and was put into a high-security mental institution. Her mom said she had no idea if he was still alive or where he was today. That was the last she had ever heard about him. And so, Jen decided to do some of her own homework. She managed to figure out where the man was being held. She requested a meeting with him. She wanted to ask him face to face what he had been planning to do to her. She needed to know why. And to her surprise, he agreed to meet with her. The meeting was scheduled. But the day before it was supposed to happen, he took his own life. Jen never found out if his decision was a direct result of their impending meeting, but it certainly seemed likely. And unfortunately, that's where the story ends. She never got any more answers. It will forever end with a big, haunting question mark. What was he going to do to her, and why? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya! Somewhere deep in a forest in France, a girl began to realize something was wrong. At first, it was just the sound of a bell ringing somewhere between the trees, and every time she stopped to listen, it would disappear like it was never there at all. But the deeper she went into the forest, the more certain she became of one thing. Something was there with her just out of sight. In June of 2019, an 18-year-old girl named Bella was finishing up her first year of college. She was excited to head home for the summer. Her family lived on the outskirts of a small town in France, a place tucked away in the mountains and almost completely surrounded by a massive, dense forest. Growing up there, Bella had spent a huge amount of her childhood exploring that forest. Sometimes she would go by herself, other times with her father, or maybe with her cousins. Over the years, she had come to know the woods like the back of her hand. She knew every trail, every landmark, every quiet little spot. Her absolute favorite place in this entire forest was a small, man-made lake that was situated deep inside, almost at the very center of the woods. It wasn't a very large lake, but the view was breathtaking and it was always incredibly peaceful. It was her go-to spot to clear her head. Getting there was a little ritual she had perfected over the years. She would leave her house, get into her small car, and drive for a couple of miles down a quiet country road. At a very specific, unmarked spot, she would pull over onto the gravel shoulder. There were no signs, no designated parking area. It was just a place she and her family had discovered, a hidden gateway to their part of the forest. After parking, she'd get out, and instead of walking along the road, she would turn and walk directly into the line of trees that grew right up against the shoulder. The underbrush was thick for the first few feet, but it quickly opened up into a small clearing. Just ahead, she would see a little stream trickling through the woods. To the left of this stream, there was what looked like a worn-out footpath, but it wasn't a human trail. It was an animal trail, a path carved out over years and years by deer and other wildlife making their way through the forest. Bella would walk down to this animal path and follow it as it ran parallel to the stream. She'd walk for about 15 or 20 minutes, just enjoying the quiet sounds of nature until the path took a sharp turn to the left, heading away from the water. At that point, Bella would leave the animal trail behind. She'd continue walking straight, following the stream north, deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. This part of the journey involved stepping carefully on mossy rocks in the stream and walking along the muddy banks on either side. It was a slower pace, and it would take her about an hour of steady walking before the stream eventually met up with a much larger river that ran from east to west. When she reached this river, Bella would turn left, heading west, and follow the riverbank for another 20 minutes or so. And then, finally, the river would open up and feed directly into her destination, the man-made lake. She would find a comfortable rock to sit on, watch the animals, listen to the wind in the trees, and just feel totally at peace. To get back, she would just retrace her steps exactly. The whole trip, one way, from her car to the lake, took about 2 hours. A big part of why Bella loved this place so much was because it felt like it belonged to her and her family. In all her years of coming out here, the only other people she had ever seen in this part of the forest or anywhere near the lake were members of her own family. It was their secret, their private sanctuary. So, in June of that year, when Bella finally came home from college, one of the first things she wanted to do was go out to the lake. She hadn't been in months because of school, and she was really missing her happy place. One morning, she got up early, told her parents where she was headed, and set out by herself. She got in her car, drove the familiar couple of miles, and pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. She got out, turned away from the road, and walked into the forest. She found the stream, then the animal path beside it. She walked for a few minutes until the trail cut to the left, and just as she always did, she stayed with the stream, continuing her journey north. About 30 minutes later, when she was still a good mile or two away from the east-west river, she heard something. It was a bell. Somewhere off in the distance, far ahead of her, she heard a single, clear chime. As soon as she heard it, she stopped dead in her tracks. That was wrong. There were never any people out here. Ever. And that sound, a bell, had to come from a person or something a person had made. She stood perfectly still, listening, wondering if she had imagined it. It could have just been a strange sound, her mind playing tricks on her in the silence of the woods. She waited. And then she heard it again. But this time, it wasn't a single chime. The bell started ringing continuously. It wasn't a steady, rhythmic ringing, though. It was sporadic and uneven, almost frantic, like someone holding a bell and just shaking it randomly at a sports game. Her mind started racing, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe a dog had gotten lost out here, and it had a bell on its collar. But as she listened, she realized the sound was too loud, too resonant. It wasn't the tiny jingle of a pet's bell. This was something bigger, more substantial. She thought of other, stranger possibilities. Maybe someone had a bell in a box, and the box fell into the river upstream and was now floating down, hitting rocks and causing the sound. She was coming up with all these weird scenarios, but honestly, she wasn't scared. She was just incredibly curious. Since the sound of the bell seemed to be coming from the direction she was already heading, she decided to just keep walking. She wanted to see for herself what was making that noise. So Bella started walking along the stream again, her ears tuned to the constant random ringing up ahead. She was completely focused on it, trying to pinpoint its exact location. And then, after about 5 more minutes of walking, the bell just stopped. It went completely silent. The sudden absence of the sound was actually more startling than the sound itself. She stopped again, listening intently, expecting it to start up again, but it didn't. All she could hear now were the normal sounds of the forest, the stream, the birds, the wind. Bella had no explanation for the bell or why it had stopped, but she wasn't really worried about it. She figured there had to be a logical explanation for it, even if she couldn't think of one. So she just shrugged it off, put her focus back on her hike, and kept walking toward the lake. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Bella was still making her way along the stream. She was getting closer to the east-west river, maybe only a half-mile away now. That's when she saw something up ahead on the left bank of the stream. It was a dark lump on the ground. At first, she couldn't tell what it was. It could have been a strangely shaped rock or maybe an animal. As she got closer, she realized it was a beaver lying motionless on the ground, and this beaver was missing its head. Now, this was a huge forest, and Bella knew perfectly well that it was full of wild animals. Finding the body of an animal that had been killed by a predator wasn't unusual. That was just nature. But as she stood over it, something struck her as deeply wrong. The cut on the beaver's neck was incredibly neat and uniform. It looked like its head had been very carefully removed with an extremely sharp knife. And the beaver's head was nowhere in sight. This definitely didn't look like the work of a predator. The teeth and claws of an animal would have left a ragged, torn mess. Also, the rest of the beaver's body was completely untouched. Whatever had killed it clearly wasn't interested in eating it. As Bella stood there staring down at the bizarre sight, she also noticed there was no smell. Usually, when an animal dies, the process of decomposition starts quickly and it creates a very distinct odor. The lack of any smell told Bella that this beaver must have been killed very, very recently. Then she gently nudged the body with the toe of her shoe and saw that it was still fairly limp. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body that happens shortly after death, hadn't set in yet. As all these facts clicked into place in her mind, a cold realization washed over her. This beaver had died only a short time ago, which meant that whoever or whatever had killed it was probably still somewhere nearby. And then Bella couldn't help but connect the dead beaver to the bell she had heard earlier. Before, the bell was just a curiosity. But now, considering the sound had come from the same general area where this freshly killed and decapitated beaver was now lying, it made her deeply uneasy. Her head snapped up, and she found herself frantically scanning the trees, her eyes darting in every direction. She was looking for a person, maybe a hunter, someone who could explain what was going on. But she saw nothing. There was no movement, no sound, just the dense, silent woods. She felt a wave of panic begin to rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stop. She took a deep breath and told herself to calm down. It was broad daylight. She had been coming to these woods her entire life and had never seen another person, never had a dangerous encounter with an animal. She was sure everything was fine. She had to be overreacting. She had nothing to worry about. So, she took another deep breath, carefully stepped over the beaver's body, and kept on walking. Eventually, Bella reached the East-West River. She made the left turn and walked the final 20 minutes along its bank until she reached the man-made lake. She sat for a while, enjoying the beautiful view and the familiar scenery, trying to push the image of the beaver out of her mind. After some time, she got up, turned around, and began the long walk back. She passed the spot where the beaver was still lying on the ground, walked all the way back to her car, and went home, feeling a little unsettled, but mostly okay. A week went by. Bella was at home feeling bored and restless. On an impulse, she decided that the only cure for her boredom was a trip back to the place she loved most, the man-made lake. She told her parents where she was going, and then she left the house. It was already 6 p.m. when she got in her car, drove to the pull-off, parked, and entered the woods. Sunset that night was at 9, so Bella knew she couldn't linger. This would have to be a quick trip if she wanted to avoid being caught in the forest after dark. She found the animal trail and started her journey along the stream. She followed it until the trail veered left, and then she continued along the stream bed. As she was walking, she started to hear the distant rumble of thunder. She looked up through the canopy of leaves and could see the sky was growing dark, much darker than it should be. It was still a couple of hours before sunset, so she knew a storm was rolling in. But Bella was determined. She was not going to turn back. She wanted to get to that lake. So instead of heading back to her car, she did the opposite. She started jogging along the stream, trying to get there as fast as she possibly could. Almost as soon as she picked up her pace, the first raindrops began to fall. By the time she passed the spot where the beaver corpse had been lying on the ground, it hadn't moved, the rain was really coming down. About 15 minutes after she passed the corpse, she finally reached the East-West River. By this point, the rain had turned into a full-blown downpour. Still, Bella was resolute. She turned left at the river and continued west, intending to go all the way to the lake. But after only a minute or two of walking along the river, with about 20 minutes still left to go, she stopped herself. She looked at her watch and saw that it was already after 8 o'clock. She started thinking it through logically. If she turned around right now, it would still take her over an hour to get back to her car. Sunset was at 9. It was already past 8. That meant, best case scenario, she was going to have to navigate the last part of her journey in the dark. And if she went all the way to the lake first, then she would be walking in the pitch black forest for maybe up to an hour. She was confident she could probably do it, but it was also pouring rain and she was cold and soaked. If she got lost or twisted an ankle, this could turn into a very bad situation very quickly. So, as much as she wanted to keep going, she made the sensible decision. She needed to turn around and head back. She turned and began walking back along the east-west river toward the spot where the stream fed into it. She turned south and started making her way along the stream back toward her car. Because it was getting so dark and the rain was so heavy, visibility was terrible. She kept her head down, watching the ground, trying not to trip. She was carefully placing her feet on rocks and muddy patches, making sure her footing was solid. The rain was pounding all around her. She had been walking like this for about 15 minutes when, all of a sudden, something hit her hard on the top of her head. Reflexively, she cried out and looked up, throwing her hands in front of her face to protect herself. And then she saw what she had just run into. It was the beaver corpse. It was hanging from a string, dangling from a tree branch directly over the path. And its head, which had been missing before, had been found. It had been crudely stitched onto the beaver's own front paws. So she was looking at this grotesque, dangling puppet of a beaver carrying its own head, and she had walked right into it. Her first reaction was to gag. She felt like she was going to vomit right there. She was so disgusted. Then she started frantically rubbing at her hair where the wet, decomposing thing had touched her, terrified that some fluid from it had gotten on her. After a moment of panicked scrubbing, she stopped. And something truly terrifying dawned on her. Whoever had strung this beaver up in this tree and had taken the time to stitch its head onto its paws had done it in the last 30 minutes. Because just 30 minutes earlier, on her way in, she specifically remembered seeing the beaver carcass on the ground. She saw it. It was in the same spot it had been a week ago. And now, here it was, hanging from a tree. As the wheels turned in her head, Bella came to a chilling conclusion. If someone had just done this, then that someone was probably still here. They were probably nearby. At this point, it was getting really dark. The rain was hammering down, and she felt completely exposed. She started whipping her head around, trying to peer through the downpour into the dark woods, searching for anyone who might have done this. But all she could see was the dark, blurry shape of the forest in every direction. She knew she was at least an hour away from her car, even if she ran. Suddenly, she was totally and completely panicked. In a desperate effort to calm herself down, she whispered to herself, "Okay, I need to get out of here, but I have to walk. If I start running, I'll fall, I'll get lost, this will turn into a nightmare. Just walk. Try to walk." So she took a shaky breath, walked around the dangling beaver corpse, and started moving along the stream again. But as soon as she was past it, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She could hear movement behind her. A rustling sound. She didn't know what it was. It could have been a deer, just some animal startled by the storm. But she was far too afraid to turn around and look. And even though she was telling herself to stay calm, to just keep walking, that she was safe and just freaking herself out, she could feel her pace quickening. Her walk turned into a jog, and then finally she broke into a full-on sprint, running down the stream away from that beaver and whatever was moving in the trees behind her. At some point, maybe 5 or 6 minutes after seeing the beaver, she was so out of breath from sprinting that she had to slow down to a walk. As soon as she slowed down, still without turning around, she heard it again. The sound of that bell. It was the exact same sound she had heard the week before, that constant, sporadic ringing. But in her panicked state, she couldn't tell where it was coming from. Her anxiety was so high, her heart was pounding so loud, she didn't know if it was behind her, or to the side, or all around her. It was now completely dark, and she was full-blown terrified. There was someone or something behind her, the person who had strung up that beaver, and they were probably watching her right now. Even though she was beyond exhausted and could barely breathe, she started sprinting again as fast as her legs would carry her. She stumbled and fell on the slippery rocks. She tripped over roots, not even looking where she was going anymore. And in the background, all around her, she could hear that bell chiming, and she could hear something crashing through the woods behind her. She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out her iPhone. As she was running, she managed to dial her father. She pressed the phone to her ear, crying, panting, gasping for air. Her father picked up, and she was so relieved to hear his voice, but she couldn't even form a sentence. She just started wailing, pleading with him. "Dad, come out to the forest! Meet me at the spot where the trail veers away from the stream. Meet me there. There's someone in the forest, they're chasing me, and I can't see them." Her father, on the other end of the line, didn't know what to make of it, but he could hear the pure primal fear in his daughter's voice. He didn't waste time with questions. He just said, "Stay on the line. I'm coming to meet you right now." Bella's father and mother, with Bella still on the phone with them, ran out of their house. They jumped in their car and sped the couple of miles down the road. They parked next to their daughter's car, and as they were getting out, they could hear it. Way off in the woods, they could hear the faint sound of the bell. They could hear their daughter screaming on the phone, and they could hear that same bell sound coming through the phone's speaker. She was begging them, "Please, come into the woods, come in here, save me." Her parents ran into the woods and started charging up the stream. Meanwhile, Bella was still deep in the forest, still 10 or 15 minutes away from them. She could barely run anymore. She had used up almost all of her energy. And as she got closer and closer to where her parents would be, the sporadic ringing of the bell was getting louder and louder and louder. Whatever it was gaining on her. She could hear sticks and branches snapping right behind her, as if something was just feet away. Finally, when it felt like the bell was ringing right behind her head, she just stopped. It was a moment of complete defeat. She was too far away from her parents. She wasn't going to make it to them in time. It was almost as if she felt she had no choice but to turn around and finally see whatever it was that was hunting her. So, terrified beyond words, so scared and so tired she could barely breathe, Bella slowly turned around. When she turned, she found herself facing a small clearing she had just run past. Because it was a clearing, a little bit of moonlight was able to filter down through the trees, just enough to illuminate the space, which was about 50 feet across. As she looked across this clearing, at first she saw nothing. And then a tall, dark figure walked into the clearing from the trees on the other side. As soon as it stepped into the faint light, she could see it had a bell tied at its waist. With every single step it took, its leg would strike the bell, causing that violent ringing sound. This thing started moving across the clearing, and as Bella stared at it, it was like time slowed down. She couldn't process what she was seeing. She didn't know what it was. All she knew was that whatever or whoever this was, it was coming straight for her. And then, suddenly, Bella felt an unbelievable rush of adrenaline. It was like her body went into autopilot, a pure survival instinct. She turned around and began sprinting faster than she had ever sprinted in her entire life. And as she ran, all she could hear was the sound of that bell, which she now understood was the sound of its steps. The bell was getting faster and faster, louder and louder. She knew it was gaining on her. She started screaming out loud, lying, "I'm on the phone with the police! They're right up ahead. They're going to be here any second." But whatever was behind her wasn't fazed. It just kept charging forward, closing the distance second by second. Meanwhile, her parents had made it to the meeting spot. But her father couldn't just stand there and wait. He started charging deeper into the woods towards the sounds. He could hear his daughter's screams, he could hear the bell getting louder and louder, and he just ran straight towards it. And sure enough, just seconds later, he saw his daughter compounding out of the dark forest. She saw him and leaped into his arms. He grabbed her, turned around, and ran with her back to the meeting spot. He grabbed his wife, and the three of them just charged out of the forest, back to the parking lot, back into their car. And they sped away. In the car, all of them were crying. They had no idea what to make of what had just happened. Bella was trying to describe what she saw, but she couldn't get the words out. Her parents had been on the phone listening to their daughter's terrified screams, and all they kept saying to each other was, "I heard the bell. I heard the bell. I heard the bell." That sound confirmed their worst nightmares. There really was someone or something out in those woods that was trying to harm their child. They drove straight to the police station, where Bella filed a report about everything she had experienced in the forest. Afterwards, as a precaution, her parents took her to the hospital. She was determined to be physically okay, besides some bumps and bruises from falling. The following morning, the police went out to the forest. They went to the area Bella had described and conducted a thorough search all along the animal trail and the stream. But they never found any sign of this tall, dark figure with the bell. Bella had told the police that she was carrying a handbag and that she had dropped it while she was running. She remembered exactly where along the stream she had dropped it, but when the police searched that area, the bag was gone. Also, the beaver was no longer there. It wasn't tied to the tree, and it wasn't on the ground. It had vanished. The only thing the police found that was out of the ordinary was a t-shirt. A little ways off from the stream, basically along the path Bella would have been running, they found a t-shirt that was neatly folded and placed carefully underneath a rock. But the police, Bella and her family, had no idea what that was supposed to mean. Ultimately, the police told Bella and her family that more than likely what she had run into was some kind of mentally unstable person who was living out in the woods. Perhaps when Bella came into the forest, this person felt like she was trespassing on their property, and so they tried to scare her away. But Bella has a very hard time accepting that explanation. She felt with every fiber of her being that as she was running from whoever was behind her, she was in mortal danger. She believes that if her father hadn't run into the woods and literally grabbed her and carried her the rest of the way, she might not have gotten out of there at all. She might have been attacked and killed by whatever that was. And when she looks back on the experience, she can't help but think about that moment when she turned around and looked across that clearing. When she saw that figure step into the moonlight for the first time, she remembers that the way it was moving, the steps it was taking, they weren't normal. They were abnormal, disjointed. There was something so off about its movement that for a second, it didn't even seem like she was looking at a person, but maybe some kind of large animal. Since her ordeal, there have been no other strange sightings reported in those woods. But then again, almost no one ever goes into that part of the forest except for Bella and her family. And Bella and her family, they don't go in those woods anymore. So whoever or whatever is out there is still just out there. The police never found anyone or anything in that forest. No trace of the shadow. No trace of the beaver. Nothing. It's just an empty forest and the sound of a bell that no one can fully explain. To this day, Bella and her family refuse to ever go near that forest again. Because anything out there has never proven that it has left.